What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 12. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. As much as Sokka wished to continue staying in the North Pole, only a part of his duties as the Avatar's companion was done with, and he had to return to Ba Sing Se to continue the rest of them. At least throughout his ship ride back to the city, Sokka carried the lingering warmth of Yu's parting hug. The fuzziness it imparted should last him long enough for their big reunion. Watching Xing's representatives carry themselves on the ship, Sokka still found it astonishing that they were so okay with having such a major vulnerability revealed. Run and her people must be really sure of themselves or Xing to be able to be so sanguine about losing fire bending, even for a short while. He couldn't imagine his friends taking the prospect of losing their bending so calmly. But then again, Sokka remembered fire-spewing tanks Xing had, and the earth and waterbenders working with him. Plus the soldiers of the 11th were still capable fighters, fire bending or not. Ba Sing Se would be far from helpless if that day came and the worst came to pass. Preparations are underway in case this information is leaked or misused, Ren had confidently told the Northern Water Tribe leaders. It is a fact that the more people are exposed to a secret, the less of a secret it becomes. Trust me when I say that Ba Sing Se will do its part, even if other parties try to, but enduring our supposed moment of weakness. That threat had been backed up with Grand Aunt Kylan gleefully reminding everyone in the tribal council of who Xing is. I've had a glimpse of some of the prince's plans, she cackled darkly. Too darkly for Sokka's tastes. Pity the poor fools like King K if they think they can seize the city while the 11th are busy. You have my word that this information will not leave this room, Chief Arnook reassured them, likely in an attempt to wash his hands clean in case the impossible happened. And rest assured, the Northern Water Tribe remembers its debt to Prince Xing. We will not entertain any notions of hostility against him and his claims on Ba Sing Se. So long as he and his people do the same, Sokka had to admit, the way Xing was leveraging his reputation was quite impressive and worth learning from. Keep within the rules of war, but be as ruthless and unhinged as you like within those confines. It made Earth Kingdom villages treat the defiant 11th as more of an undeniable but unoppressive force, and speak of them as if they were a convenience to be tolerated rather than resented. And being so infamous meant that Earth Kingdom conscripts, Sokka still found that idea of such military service for farmers to be abnormal, were already eager to flee or surrender before they even met the 11th. And over here, Xing's conduct gave his words some considerable weight in the Northern Water Tribe, enough that Chief Arnook was already keen on sending out an envoy to Ba Sing Se once the day of Black Sun was over with. For a guy that did a lot of horrible things, Xing sure was getting a lot of respect simply by keeping said horrible things confined to the battlefield. And criminals that deserved to be put down, of course, like the Dai Li of Ba Sing Se, and the rapists and sadists the 11th came across, be they Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom. Rin liked regaling Sokka with tales of how she got to sneak into some camp or barracks to horrifically mutilate. His mind automatically blocked out the exact details. Common soldiers and even officers to death for being very indecent human beings. Our old Colonel Li Dai, disapproved of how we did it, but not why we did it. The old man hated injustice just like the rest of us, but him getting into trouble would have been really bad for us. So Xing led HM. Yeah, he definitely led me and a few others to do what had to be done. How the captain could be so damn cheery when reminiscing about such bloody times was beyond Sokka. We learned a lot more from sneaking around barracks and colonial manors compared to trying to sneak into Earth Kingdom camps, she said with a nasty chuckle before she fell into a scowl. Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom, maybe even water tribes have them. But there's something about being the only guys allowed to wield a sword or wear a fancy hat that makes some men dash, and women, one of her lieutenants chipped in. Remember that time in? Rin waved a hand and nodded with some annoyance. Yeah, that sick bitch in Pohai, right? Yeah, some men and women devolve into monsters that make dark spirits paragons of virtue. Sickos that need to be put down. Just don't forget to help the victims as well, Grand Aunt Kylan added as she joined them on the ship's deck. Retribution is good, but rebuilding lives is better. The old waterbender paused for a second and then shrugged. Though sometimes a good place to start rebuilding is by providing closure. That's why it's good to keep the monstrous bastards alive. Give their surviving victims the chance to personally kill off their nightmares. Was Sokka rattled at how nonchalantly his grandaunt was giving tips on how to enact bloody vengeance? Maybe a little. But Kylan was not the hate-blinded crazy psychopath that Hama was. There was a contentedness and certainty in Sokka's grandaunt that he realized he envied. Grand gave off something of the same air, except that Kylan's had a sharper edge to hers. A calmness forged out of violence and suffering. The bits of her past she let Sokka and Katara know about hammered home just how different they saw and reacted to the world around them. Grandaunt Kylan endured much for so long, and was happy to repay blood with blood. Sokka and his friends had only been spending nearly a year running and flying about, keeping away from most of the trouble that chased after them. Did that soften their resolve? Sokka began to wonder. Did their relatively carefree travels up until meeting Shing shield them from the harsher realities of war? Or was it simply because they were young and lucky? It was hard for Sokka to compare himself to Shing, knowing what he did of the guy's past life now. An orphan raised by a band of soldiers. No wonder he came out the way he did. If anything, it was a minor miracle that he wasn't more bloodthirsty. But still, was Toph right that the gang were being a bit naive? And when the time came, could Sokka join the other warriors in combat? Could he willingly strike to heavily wound or even kill his opponents? Should he? For what little it was worth. Those questions ran about in Sokka's head without Captain Ruin or Grandaunt Kylan, or anyone else giving him their thoughts on the matter. He didn't raise the question, so they didn't provide any answers. His grandaunt did offer an important bit of semi-related advice, though. When you have to fight, however you go about it, be decisive. No hesitation, Sokka. Regret and grieve later, but never hesitate. You are being dragged into war, where mercy is scarce and honor is left at the camps. If you change your mind, be quick and certain about it. She delivered such heavy words with a sad, almost forlorn smile, further hammering home her point into Sokka's head. And do not be so reckless with your life. You are a warrior. You fight for your tribe, your family. The longer you're up and breathing, the longer you can protect them. At this, Kylan's face truly fell for perhaps the first time. The naked regret and grief in her expression broke Sokka's heart. If I wasn't so ready to throw my life away to fight the Fire Nation back then, I'd have remembered that I could have used my time to find if my family were still alive. If Hakoda was all right, I could have been there for poor Kia. There was a sigh of remorse, and then she fixed Sokka with a hard stare that made him reel back a little. Learn from me, Sokka. Fight for those close to you. And do not, never forget why you fight. The way she stared at him, the intense, faraway look in her eyes, made Sokka gulp and nod in silence. They returned to Boss Sing Se to little fanfare. Only a squad of the 11th waiting to receive them. As Sokka noticed the frantic bustle of people moving about and working, and he could feel the nervousness of reforging the city's industry. Scaffolds rose up here and there to drape around particular buildings. Convoys of carts and wagons trundled through the streets with piles of metal and bricks and lumber. And that was just the docks. As Sokka followed everyone back to the palace, he caught sight of further renovations. Parts of Ba Sing Se's famous monorail were gone, with signs of new rail sections being built to divert the route. Whole blocks in the middle ring, which were once shop lots if Sokka remembered right, were replaced with larger, sturdier buildings that sprouted chimneys. Finding a rope floating up to the heavens, Sokka then noticed a mechanist's balloon bobbing lazily high up in the air. His gliders were also soaring about, its occupants often carrying baskets, Sokka noticed. Shing was sure fast to make use of them. Sokka! He turned his head towards the source of Katara's voice, and found his sister running up to him alongside Toph. You're back, Katara exclaimed with a smile. Both girls looked a bit worn, with the former showing clear signs of restrained annoyance. The rest of the North Pole delegation went back to the palace, leaving Sokka to hang out with his sister and friend. How did things go? Toph inquired with mild curiosity. About as expected, really, Sokka answered with a shrug of his shoulders. The Northern Water Tribe will work with Xing, so long as Aang works with Xing. And you? Katara asked with an uncharacteristic gleam in her eyes. Sokka didn't let that trip him up. Oh, she's good. There, that should be casual enough. He's blushing, isn't he? Or not? That he is Toph. How'd you know? I can feel his heartbeat pick up, the blind bandit blandly answered, and then fixed him with a smirk. It must be nice meeting your fiancé again. Did you go all cuddly and snoggy on each other? Any long, teary goodbyes? I mean. And there went his composure, and Sokka was left stammering for a bit as both girls teased him. It was a bit irritating, but he didn't mind it too much. The time with you was nice, however short it was. And what about you two? Sokka asked after their first barrage, to hopefully change the topic. How's farm life like? At that, Katara instantly took on an expression of utmost loathing. Ugh, it was fun. Toph cut in, clearly to rile up his sister. I thought moving farmlands and roads was boring, but it turned out to be a fun puzzle. Yeah, fun for you, Katara remarked dryly. Toph snickered as she turned her blank eyes to Sokka. Sugar Queen here's just pissy because Her Highness doesn't like being down in the mud. It's not the mud, Katara replied a bit too defensively. Sokka thought but wisely did not voice out. It was just so tedious having to control the water from spilling out of the ditches for days while you got to play, move the farms around. I was just a glorified walking dam. Yeah, well I don't see the other waterbenders complaining or huffing. Sokka couldn't resist. A Toph? You can dash, I know, she instantly returned with a dismissive wave of her hand. I'm being figurative, Sokka. Katara sighed and rolled her eyes. I'm just not used to using waterbending for such normal tasks. You meant to say boring. The glare she gave Sokka made Katara adorably petulant. I did not. It's like I said. Toph came in, her voice affecting an exaggerated posh tone. Her Highness doesn't care for the lowly tasks that are clearly meant for peasants like us. Seeing Katara growl with rising annoyance, her brother quickly tried changing gears to de-escalate the situation. Well, at least you got to practice your waterbending, right? I mean, Grandaunt said it'd be good for you. That got her to calm down, sighing out her frustration. I guess I can sort of waterbend longer, I think. And with more control, Toph added helpfully, which surprised Katara. She can pull the water out of the ground quite well. And if I heard it right, Toph tapped her foot to emphasize how she eavesdropped. She was doing a better job at controlling the irrigation flow than most of the adult waterbenders. Wow, that's great, Katara. It was hard to not break into a stupid grin at how the flattery made his sister switch to half-fake modesty. But Sokka managed to keep a straight face. Well, it wasn't that hard. They began to head back to the palace after allowing Katara to bask in the praise offered to her. And Sokka found himself impressed at not just what the girls were doing, but the plans Xing had concocted that required reshaping the agrarian zone. The focus had been on the farmlands near the breaches for the time being, which was where everyone expected any attackers to hit. From what Toph and Katara explained, roads were made to connect the entrances of Boss Sing Se's outer wall with the city's interior. Paddy fields, orchards, and other such plantations were moved closer to the outer wall, while cereal and other flatter crops took up the lands closer to the inner wall. It was a rather ambitious attempt to shape the terrain to favor the city's defenders. It made the roads a highly valuable asset for armies to march through the breaches. Otherwise, they'd be slowed down by the mud of the paddy fields or the maze of trees and bushes. Wheat, cabbages, and other vegetables would be grown closer to the inner walls, so that any invaders would gain the most minimal advantage of cover. Right now, the work only took up a small slice of Ba Sing Se, and who knows how long it'll take for Xing's changes to be finished. But there was no doubt that it was some far-sighted thinking the guy had. And the paranoia to fuel such ambitious precaution must be something, too. With how uneventful things are for us, I wonder how Aang's holding up. Sokka wondered aloud. His sister chuckled. He's with Bumi. No doubt they'll be caught up in some sort of trouble. Toph nodded, also smiling at the idea. I sort of feel bad for Prince Iroh, having to rein in Aang and Bumi. It turns out, their estimations were completely off the mark, as days later, it was an exasperated Aang that crawled off Appa, while Iroh and Bumi seemed in high spirits. What happened to you? Sokka had to ask, to which the Avatar wearily answered with a single word, politics. Huh. And here Sokka thought that Ren's and Grandaunt Kylan's work up in Agnikila was imposing. Mosey sighed with some resignation as he stared at the map of the Earth continent. The other streams of refugees had brought news that helpfully revealed the progress of the Fire Nation armies. As expected, they faced several smaller armies that were spread across the colonies. Interestingly, Princess AZULA's evacuation order had been taken up rather enthusiastically by the colonists, who gladly tore up their homes before fleeing. It showed on how little progress most of the armies made. Not a few had barely left their landing sites, being forced to wait until they could establish a supply point. Most others were making their advances along the major roads, based on news given from loyal colonial patrols. The few colonies that had been captured intact were making the most progress, but even that was relative. That was mostly thanks to stubborn rearguard actions by the colonial guards to buy the refugees time to escape. Whole colony garrisons willingly sacrificed their lives for their neighbors and friends to make it to Ba Sing Se, with many being personally led by the nobles Princess AZULA rescued from the home islands. And judging by the progress made across the continent, they were doing a damned fine job in bogging the enemy down. Loyalty begets loyalty, and Mosey quietly thanked their selflessness every now and then, especially when he was looking at the map or discussing logistics. Both Xing and the princess had made that particular news public, making heroes out of the brave men and women, be they firebender or earthbender, native or colonist, who stood before the armies of the home islands. It helped that Princess AZULA was genuinely affronted by the fact that her father's madness has forced the expenditure of lives. This should be a matter handled personally, between me and my father, or at least me and my prince, against him and his cronies, she had told an overpacked square in the middle ring. It should not have come to this, where your children, your spouses, your parents have to die on our behalf. But it has come to this. Yet me and my prince are doing our utmost to ensure that it does not spiral into another long and wasteful war. Her outrage was infectious, enough that the Ba Sing Se citizenry watching from their rooftops and balconies were also infected and chanting her name at the end of her speech. We are deciding on our options, Xing had declared. Thus far, King Bumi of Omashu has graciously given our cause a chance and extended the offer of peace. That the crazy king was here was still kept secret for now. As Mosey understood it, Xing wanted King Bumi's presence to only be announced once his army of volunteers made it to the city. The Mad King had promised the services of 5,000 earthbenders. Mosey seriously believed that that was 5,000 too many. One Mad King and one spirit-guided Xing was all they really needed when the time came. But the gesture was still appreciated. The Northern Water Tribe too has agreed to exclude us from their grudge against the Fire Nation. They also are willing to seek peaceful relations with Ba Sing Se. That it was a peace bought by Xing's unbelievable feat against Zhao was kept hidden for now. It was agreed that such information and other dirt of the Fire Nation would be released only much later, and only once Prince Iroh and the Avatar agreed to Xing's plans. It was no simple decision to establish an independent state, after all, especially for those not familiar with Xing. For now, though, Xing had to secure his influence on the city, which involved the 11th serving as middlemen of sorts between the city garrison under Generals Yu and Sung, and the various colonial troops that poured in, which meant Xing had promoted Mosey to Ba Sing Se's first High General to grant him the authority needed to accomplish the unenviable task of integrating the various groups into a united, cohesive force. At least the job was made easier with the Earth Kingdom generals affirming their loyalty to Xing in public and denouncing their former colleagues' treachery. Could they be fully trusted? Mosey and the other officers of the 11th would have preferred keeping hostages to be sure. But Xing had Princess AZULA deploy her administrative staff she had left as insurance instead. The leadership of the 11th had been initially skeptical about whether experts at Fire Nation intrigue would translate well over here. But seeing the spate of resignations and retirements of the more reluctant supporters barely a week later, it was decided that the regiment would keep out of the way of those polite and soft-spoken servants of the princess. They delivered the near-impossible proof of a captain under General Yu being intimate with ostrich horses. You do not mess with people that could not only recite word for word what the man said to the beasts as he rutted with them, but also produced his whole feather-infested and ostrich horse-scented wardrobe as evidence. That and other less scandalous dalliances created openings that were filled with officers who were less resistant to Xing's rule, if not outright more approving of it. Officially, It was all a very fortuitous turn of events. Unofficially, even Yama was showing more respect to Princess AZULA. It goes without saying that the Avatar and his friends were oblivious to all of this, of course. They were insulated from the ugliness that occurred in the shadows of politics, mostly so that they could remain focused on their own goals. The Avatar continued his training with Prince Iroh, with King Bumi chipping in as well. Supposedly the lessons were more than just firebending now. The young warrior Sokka trained under Run, while his sister Katara honed her waterbending with Kylan. Toph of the well-known and well-connected Beifong family worked with Yama's earthbenders. Interestingly, was the only one whose training Xing directly intervened in. Last Mosey heard, the girl was being put through a series of tests to overcome her biggest weakness. Supposedly, she compensated for her blindness by having a highly attuned sense of picking up vibrations from the earth, and only the earth. Xing had her spending time in a metal box, which all but dulled that sense, and forced her to workshop a way around that weakness. Time will tell if anything came out of it, but that wasn't Mosey's concern for now. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Xing in the war room, as they stared at the latest updates to the Fire Lord's armies. "Not exactly, but a message needs to be delivered." Xing pointed at the 4 invasion armies clustered together not too far west of the city. Those were the forces that had the easiest time landing in the colonies, and as such were far closer to Ba Sing Se than their peers. According to the latest reports, they also had joined up, though who had command of such a coalition was still unknown. Besides, if we hit them now, while their reinforcements are too far away, we take off that many men and resources from the board. Prince Iroh was the one to raise a counterargument. But it's also that many of us that will not be in the city, considering the news from the southeast. Xing didn't seem worried at all. Kay is blinkered, not stupid. His puppet masters too. If they want to muster a coalition force to take Ba Sing Se, they'll need way more time reaching out to allies and vassals. It'd take much longer to muster such a force. If they send an army now, it won't be enough to take the walls. Right, King Bumi? The Mad King actually looked thoughtful throughout the whole meeting and nodded slowly. Yes. Those lords there are still vying with each other for influence. King K is being hosted by Lord Shirku, who's not exactly the top dog in those parts. If he wants to keep the king with him, he'll have to maneuver himself into a position that puts him in charge of his betters. I know 3 dukes, 1 high admiral, and 2 princes that'll not be happy having to bow their heads to a mere provincial lord. Any chance they might try to fight over K? Nah, not yet. Too much cons that go with the pros. Having him with them gives them prestige, but also turns them into a target. And none of their lands are as unassailable as Ba Sing Se. The former vassals of Ba Sing Se are used to peace and having the fighting be far away. I'm sure they'd prefer things to remain that way for as long as possible. They'll likely wait until Ba Sing Se is recaptured before negotiating for honors, or at worst swoop in to rescue King K if Shirku gets invaded. More prestige that way. Another bunch of cowards, Princess AZULA hissed, earning a shrug from the Mad King. In this case, cowardice is to our advantage, Xing said, absently placing a calming hand on her arm as he addressed the war room's attendees. So until our good friend Ji Choi brings us news of actual mobilization, our borders with the Earth Kingdom in exile are secure enough. You sure you don't want me to go down there and secure it some more? King Bumi asked cheekily. Xing's reply mirrored the light mischief. You sure you want to be occupied for the rest of your life trying to beat the lords there into submission? Instead of being part of a whole lot of fighting. Pretend I didn't offer such a blatantly stupid thing. I already forgot what you offered. Xing gave a wry smile before turning back to the map again. Anyway, we have the chance, so we'll take it while that chance is still steaming fresh. Any other questions? Mosey raised a hand. Is it really that important that you and the princess take part in this excursion? That one probably rankled the new High General the most, even more than working with the barely integrated forces of Ba Sing Se. It's a great risk, I'd argue an unnecessary one. It is, Xing admitted with a shrug, but as I said, a message needs to be delivered. Ozai's supporters, and especially those under them, need to know what they're in for. But Princess AZ- I know the risks, said Princess Cut In with a slightly imposing glare. If Xing's going, then so am I, might as well make the message clear. Once more Xing shrugged. I tried, but my fiancé is as hard to convince out of a fight as I am. Mosey could only sigh. At least you know what kind of a difficult brat you've been, Kai said beside him through a grin. Look on the bright side, the young prince offered with an amused smirk. At least it's only AZULA joining me. How's that better? Prince Iroh helpfully took the bait and asked. Lady Suwei's still angry that she had to give up her island to flee here. She could be following us to have a severe word with the enemy. All right. Not even Run and Ping in their most vengeful would subject anyone to that widow's wrath. I suppose I'll begin mobilization. Mosey relented as he ignored Prince Iroh's appalled grimace. Good. Xing gave King Bumi and Prince Iroh a final glance. Avatar Aang and his friends have been informed as to why their intervention is not required. Both King and Prince nodded. We've made the reasonings of it clear, Prince Iroh answered. The Avatar still wishes the fighting could be averted, but he understands also that he is not capable enough to provide any such solutions. Well, as long as he's aware of his shortcomings. Princess AZULA remarked as she raised an eyebrow at Xing. Are you sure you don't want me to tutor him? He should be made aware of the hidden wheels of politics, he blandly replied, not be scared away from it. With no further topics of note, the meeting was ended, and Mosey began the migraine-inducing chore of organizing an army. As he left, he saw Xing leading Prince Iroh and King Bumi down the hallway to the gardens. Mosey lost good money when news later came of Prince Iroh being carried over to the healers after suffering a moment of weakness. He should have known that the Mad King would not have been affected at all. But still, it looked like the private meeting with the dragons went well enough. It was a pity their introductions to the enemy in a few days' time would be nowhere near as pleasant. Despite the daunting task ahead of them, the mood of the Fire Nation's punitive expedition, or those that had managed to assemble just a few days away from Boss Sing-Se anyway, was high enough. While some might find the notion of capturing the princess and the Fire Lord's brother to be distasteful, the chance to put down the insolent scorpion and return Boss Sing-Se to its rightful rulers was more than enough to keep everyone chomping at the bit. For newly promoted General Tsio, it was a chance to lay the first of many steps to not only earn the Fire Lord's favor, but also win glory for both himself and his family. He had brought his family's heirloom, a beautifully crafted blade made generations ago by a notable swordsmith. Tsio was aware of the mocking whispers accusing the venerated weapon of being too impractical in design, of being nothing more than a decorative wall piece. Hopefully, after this, he'll be able to dismiss such stupid rumors by taking the head of the traitorous scorpion with it. High General Wulong had granted Tsio's tank divisions the honor of serving as heavy reserve, shock cavalry to hurl at the enemy once they've been bogged down. It was great consideration indeed, seeing that the vehicles would be taking the role usually assigned to Komodo Rhino cavalry. This was the chance for Tsio to prove his worth. He dutifully organized his admittedly meager command for that distinguished role, carefully reading through the doctrines set by the War Ministry. While Tsio held the rank of general, he currently had barely enough men and vehicles to fill a brigade. It was a minor issue. The Fire Lord had graciously rewarded the most loyal noble houses the military ranks which, barring severe disgrace and dishonor, would be a hereditary title. The much vaunted generals of the islands, each holding dominion over one of the home islands, would become the new proof of the bond between Fire Lord and nobility. That a majority of these new generals like Tsio barely had enough men to command at the moment was merely a nuisance. The important part was that they held the title. There was no doubt that their ranks would quickly swell through honorable service and gallant deeds. The lower classes were easy enough to inspire and attract. After all, if they believed the Scorpion's honeyed lies to rise up in rebellion with him, and the deposed princess, of course, it'd be an easy enough thing to turn them over to the right side with a good show of martial prowess. The Fire Nation will restore order to the colonies, and the dumb-witted rebels from the peasant class would see the error of their ways and join the right cause. It'd be like the warlord era again, with warriors of the defeated warlords flocking to serve the first Fire Lord as he unified the islands. Tsio and the other noble scions looked forward to the glory promised by battle. Yes, there was a chance that some of them might be horrifically wounded, or they might be returned to the home islands in urns. But was it not a warrior's duty to die for his Fire Lord and Fire Nation? Tsio would do his best to make his death costly, of course. Who knows, if he showed exceptional bravery, maybe Tsio could be the one to capture the princess. And if he proved himself enough, perhaps he could petition the Fire Lord to spare his errant daughter and award her to Tsio. A former princess would have no titles or claims to leverage, but he was sure she'd be more than grateful enough to keep her life, even as a mere concubine. And to that end, the young general, not as young as the Scorpion, but then again no mere boy should be put in such a rank, pored through texts with his peers and listened attentively to the advice of High General Wulong and other veteran commanders as they waited for the other armies, while sheer numerical superiority ensured their victory in this overblown civil war. It would be foolish to assume that fighting turncoat colonists would be the same as facing against the decrepit forces of the Earth Kingdom. The forces of the traitor Scorpion and the misguided princess were unlike anything the Fire Nation had faced before. But the educated guesses of the sharpest minds of the War Ministry and War Council would help them adapt quickly to their foe. And for however powerful the rebel prince was, he was just one boy. The walls of Ba Sing Se are long, and there are plenty of places to hit to overwhelm and exhaust him. It goes without saying that the supposed tactics recommended by the Scorpion through Princess AZULA had been pointedly ignored. There was no good to be served from taking his poisoned words seriously. Who knows what sort of weakness the insidious boy had embedded in his suggestions? Honing his mind against the treacherous ploys, Seo and his fellow commanders were rudely interrupted by an unexpected report. The Scorpion had left its den and was heading over to meet them. On the face of it, it seemed a reasonable plan. Hit the punitive force before its other elements could gather with it. But the Scorpion led a meager force of barely 5,000 ungrateful bastards to face off against the assembled might of nearly 20,000 loyal Fire Nation warriors. Seo and his friends would have brushed it off as a suicide march, but High General Wulong and some other hardened officers had reminded everyone of what reputation the boy had built for himself. However grave their advice was, Seo still found it hard to fathom that 4-to-1 odds could possibly go to the traitor prince's favor, especially on this large a scale. The punitive force assembled in good order, falling into formation to greet the coming foe. Nigh unending rows of banners fluttered proudly in the air, declaring the presence of the loyal servants of the Fire Lord. The thousands of spear tips of infantry blocks glinted in the afternoon sunlight, with rows of firebenders standing quietly between them. In the flanks, the rumbling of tank squadrons competed with the growl of Komodo rhino packs as they waited in hungry anticipation. It was a glorious sight, especially contrasted against the inferior enemy, who came in small blocks that were led by what little tanks they had. They marched through the open grasslands with an arrogance that annoyed Seo, as if a mere 5,000 traitors could stand against the Fire Nation. Orders came from high command. Seo relayed them through succinct barks before lowering himself into his tank, unable and unwilling to wipe the savage grin off his face. The enemy had walked right up to them, so they'll repay their favor and proceed to wipe them out promptly to save everyone the time. Hundreds of tanks and Komodo rhinos began to move, sweeping around to flank and surround the enemy on either side. The infantry pushed for the center as one. The rebels would have to hunker down to have any hope of surviving the coming assault. Seo would like to see them try, just to see his tanks' treads mulch them. Yet they did not close ranks, as common doctrine said they should. Instead, the enemy formed a diamond probably no more than 4 ranks deep. General Seo found himself unable to comprehend the suicidal tactics of the enemy for several seconds, and then growled with annoyance. Full speed, straight towards them. If they want to die so eagerly, we'll kindly speed things up for them. With brightly colored flags waving in the air and standing out even in the rising cloud of dust, the message was efficiently sent through the division, and the flank turned and accelerated almost as one. They closed in enough for Seo to see the banners the rebels flew. The black dragon-pincered scorpion, set to the fore of a golden-yellow phoenix spreading its wings, itself set in a rich red background. The exiled princess had boldly adopted a new personal emblem, it seems, and had proclaimed her ties with the scorpion. So be it. It'd make the joy of capturing her all the sweeter. Seo squinted through his tank's firing port, catching as many details as he could of the enemy's meager formation. The enemy tanks were queerly shaped, their infantry heavily armored. Interesting tidbits, but nothing more. Where was the scorpion? Seo continued peering as they closed in to about a couple hundred yards, and then he saw the first signs of enemy retaliation. Small puffs of smoke burst out seemingly from every other soldier, soaring towards the wall of tanks. The general struggled to process what the trails of smoke might be, until a naphtha pot shattered on his tank's hull, just in front of the firing port. He regretted gasping in surprise, as it made him taste the thick, foul smoke that now billowed into the tank. The tank skidded to a halt as Tsio and his crew began struggling to breathe. Arms flailed to find the hatches as teary eyes were closed tightly and lungs spasmed hard. Eventually, an exit was found, and Tsio clambered out with all haste. The air outside was barely any better than within the confines of his vehicle. But at least the general could now afford to open his eyes, and he immediately wished he hadn't. The smog was so thick and prevalent that Tsio could barely make out the shapes of men and tanks a stone's throw away from him. What he could see was disheartening. A whole mess of tanks stopped, some tipping over to their sides, their crew all desperately crawling out for breathable air. He thought he could hear the pained roars of Komodo rhinos further back, the beasts probably smart enough to avoid entering the noxious cloud. Fighting to regain his composure, Tsio stood on his tank in a vain hope to pierce the thick smog, and was rewarded with nothing. A void opened in the bottom of his guts as he heard nothing beyond the sounds of creaking and snapping metal, and the desperate coughing of abused lungs. His whole division, the whole flank, had been halted by the wall of smoke. The general's martial pride suffered a great wound at that realization. Before he could fully bemoan his fate, Tsio's ears picked up a new sound, one that definitely came from the enemy's side. Flashes blinked off in the distance, followed by the distinctive roar of flames. The general tried to rally his men, but wound up in a coughing fit as he accidentally gulped in more of the horrid air. He quickly regained control of his lungs and body, and tried again. This time, he was permanently interrupted by someone landing on his head with such force that his neck snapped. General Tsio was dead well before the daggers bit into his neck, and he was spared the sight of chainmail-masked figures dropping from the sky to slaughter his men. Poor bastards, Suki couldn't help saying as she began to pick up on the screams coming from the wall of noxious smoke just outside either end of the formation. With just one barrage from the naphtha launchers, she watched a cacophonous tide of steel come to a screeching and complete stop. And then, after waiting for a few seconds to make sure no tanks were coming out, Xing sent in his first wave, the veterans of the 11th. Firebenders took to the skies in great bursts of fire, while spearmen and earthbenders grimly marched into the smog. Suki saluted the brave men with all the respect she could muster. She was standing at a safe distance away, and her eyes were already tearing and her nose burning from just a faint whiff of the foul concoction. The other soldiers arrayed before her were already coughing, and some were on their knees puking their lunches out, and the men and women of the 11th were going into the cloud like it was nothing. And then the screaming of the dying reached the lines, and Suki knew that the first wave of the Fire Lord's forces were doomed. "Well done, Xing," AZULA complimented from beside Suki. "What now?" Her fiancé responded with a shrug of his shoulders. "We wait for the screaming to stop so that the enemy can catch their breath. And then we give them cause to scream again." Xing made it sound so easy, but then again, perhaps it was for him. After being included in their strategic meeting, and being exposed to the level of planning he presented to them, Suki finally realized just how outclassed she was against him. She was a warrior, with some comprehension of tactics to defeat a foe. Xing was a strategist, no, something more than that. He not only read the enemy's behavior, but also prepared a counter for it even before they left Ba Sing Se. The naphtha launcher was just one of many new weapons he would bring to bear, with apparently many more in the works. Metal-clad bamboo tubes packed with a charge of blasting jelly, and stuffed with a pouch of the infamous naphtha that was pointed at the enemy. The fuse on the other end was lit, and just like that, several hundred tubes castrated an otherwise brutal charge. "Hi, General Mosey. Your command, Prince Xing. Get me a report on the flanks, especially in regards to the heavy cavalry." Mosey went to consult with his secondaries, leaving Xing and AZULA standing beside one another like proud parents as they surveyed the battlefield. Suki tried not to squirm as she watched over them. After the little incident with Tai Li, Xing had offered Suki the post of AZULA's chief bodyguard. Of course she accepted the position, though not in the capacity of a Kyoshi warrior. Suki wore the green battle dress of her order to honor it, but the 11th's distinctive red and black brigandine was worn on top of it. The helmet would take time getting used to, so until she got into combat, Suki kept it by her side instead of atop her head. "Hopefully you don't have to stop anyone else from kissing my princess," Xing had joked. "Though if someone does, I'm sure I can rely on you to stop them." Unfortunately, All the praise was neutered by AZULA's own crass joke. I suppose it's better to keep you with me. It's not like Tai Li will be stopping you from trying to kiss my fiancé. Suki fought hard to keep her embarrassment down at that remark, but Xing actually tripped from surprise, to the point that his bodyguard had to dive in to catch him. Suki didn't know if that was a good thing or not, but thankfully AZULA left the teasing at that and made no further mention of it. Not even when Suki found herself occasionally giving in to distracted glances. The princess only gave her a quiet stare that reminded Suki of her duty, and the girls carried on as if nothing ever happened. The enemy center is slowing, said Princess, commented with a hint of disapproval. They're seeing their flanks disappear in clouds of smoke without coming out the other end. Their commanders are understandably wary of trying to march between the cloud walls. Can't we encourage them to move? AZULA asked rather petulantly. Not yet. We can't have them cracking at the edges and fleeing in big chunks. The princess let out a heavy sigh. So we wait. So we wait, Xing echoed with a nod. Don't worry, if we're lucky, whoever's in charge there will decide to pull back for the day. How's that a good thing? Suki had to ask, remembering how Xing wanted a quick and decisive victory. His grin sent a once-forgotten tingle up her spine. Because that means we get to play at night, where they're encamped. Unfortunately, the clouds of naphtha smoke were dissipated by heavy winds shortly after, and the enemy began marching again, regardless of the sight of the fields of corpses and abandoned tanks on either side of their advance. Mosey returned, reporting light losses to the 11th in exchange for the successful shattering of the tank formations. The Komodo rhinos were fleeing, but might rally later on. Well, back to the main plan it is then, Xing said nonchalantly. Suki remembered what that plan entailed, and she looked out to the enemy ranks with genuine pity. Xing turned to one of the junior officers with a faint smirk. Kindly have the new Hobbiton ready for use. After the man ran off to relay the orders, the prince then turned to his fiancée with an indulgent smile. Would you like to do the honors, my princess? AZULA absolutely preened at the attention before she gave the declaration in a clear, sharp voice. Hans, get the Flammenwerfers. The 11th's tanks began to advance, and once more Suki could only feel bad for the enemy. Poor bastards. Unlike most of the commanders, High General Wulong knew what he was getting into. He'd personally heard the Scorpion Dragon's reports after all, and noted the various victories the defiant 11th had racked up. But the High General had been sure that the tanks and Komodo rhinos would have at least given Xing pause, buying enough time for the main assault to at least close within effective firebending range. Instead, he could only helplessly watch as the tanks were devoured by the smoke, likely lost completely, and the heavy cavalry were routing as the riders seemingly lost control of their mounts. And the infantry center was still well beyond optimum distance. There was little choice but for the men to keep their heads down and march ever forwards. The loss of life would be ridiculously heavy, but with careful managing he might still net them a victory. The enemy's tanks began to advance, a thin line of vehicles that began to spread out in an attempt to engage the entire front of the formation. Further back, the rebels' own infantry began moving at a slow pace after the vehicles. Wulong didn't know what to expect other than trouble, but to deliberate now was to surrender all initiative to the enemy, and to allow Xing full reign of his brand of bloody madness. Orders were sent to have the massive infantry block advance slowly and prepare to brace for the approaching tanks. If the commanders timed their attacks right, the war machines would be at least forced back by an unrelenting storm of fire. Those things were liable to be ovens for their crew in the wrong conditions, a weakness that usually was discounted against the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes. From his vantage point on a raised stage, Wulong watched as the punitive force formed neat rows, in preparation for the firebenders firing by rank. It was a new tactic at close range that saw success against the Earth Kingdom's northern states, and should be no less effective here. The price of exhausting the formation's firebenders was a light one considering the numerical advantage they held. It just boiled down to timing once more. Too early, and the attack would not only be ineffective, but also give the game away. Too late, and the front ranks would likely be pasted by melting tank treads. Wulong and the gaggle of senior commanders with him watched in silent anticipation as the distance between their formation and the enemies closed. From far behind the deployment grounds, the tanks seemed were fat dots spaced too far apart, utterly vulnerable to being overwhelmed by a good charge. Against any other foe, Wulong would have ordered the charge to do just that. But Xing had a reputation for unusual tactics that played on the expectations of common sense thinking. So the rows of infantry slowed to a stop as the tanks drew closer, and began letting loose a horizontal hail of fire bolts. The frontmost ranks unleashed all they had for several blistering seconds before quickly pulling back and letting those behind them take their place. Wulong felt a stirring in his chest as he watched the rotation be executed smoothly, leaving no breaks in the barrage at any point. Earth Kingdom formations with their earthen walls had been turned to ash by such a display. But here, the enemy tanks quickly reversed out of the worst of the firestorm. Their hulls glowed from the heat, with maybe a dozen or so tanks wobbling from weakened tracks. The commanders around him were cheering, but the High General knew better than to celebrate just yet. Sure enough, he saw the same foreboding puffs of smoke from before, this time launched from the back of each tank. Wulong shouted a warning, even if common sense told him that he was too far away for the soldiers to listen. The flags began to rise to relay his concern, but it was too late. Dirty gray clouds began rising all across the front rows, smothering the soldiers caught in them and ceasing the storm of fire almost immediately. The once rigid rows began to bend and flex as firebenders and spearmen hurriedly backed away from the drifting fumes. Wulong knew he had to act fast, before the advantage fell to the enemy. Order the 4th to 6th rows to resume firing. But sir, the men in th dash, their lives were forfeit the moment they were caught in the damned smoke. Fire by ranks now, before the rebels exploit the break. Thankfully, nobody else dared challenge him, and Wulong almost felt hope as the flags waved with desperation. It still took precious seconds, though, for the spotters out in the rows to notice and repeat the order. Those seconds were all the enemy needed. Scarcely had the infantry begun to hesitate to enact the order, and Wulong saw strings of glowing flame fly out of the smoke. No, not strings, streams. Glowing liquid streams. Spirits, long streams of the infamous liquid fire from Xing's mysterious weapon splashed onto unlucky soldiers. No less than a few dozen men were caught under each stream. Order a retreat. The screams began to filter back, just as chaos rippled from the front of the formation. Wulong saw the enemy tanks peeking through the fading smog, spewing out more of the accursed liquid fire across multiple ranks. As the front buckled under the surprise attack, Wulong managed to see things from behind the rising smog. Large birds, soaring up to the heavens. No, not birds. Even from this far away, the High General could tell it was some sort of contraption. And then he remembered the reports from the previous war minister's disastrous showing at the Northern Air Temple. Full retreat. Sound the drums. Now. The drums sounded shortly after, but it was already too late. The gliders shot through the air at incredible speeds, flying overhead the rows of faltering men. In their wake, more columns of dirty smoke erupted, sowing greater confusion. The rearmost ranks began to pull back with some degree of shaken order, but a full third of the loyalist formation up front were scattering aimlessly. The tanks began to advance again, faster this time, and the orderly withdrawal began to be infected by a rout as more ropes of fire landed amongst the panicking soldiers. Wulong had to squint hard to make out some brave firebenders trying to bend away the flames from their comrades. But it was a futile thing, simply because all it took was an errant spark to reignite the fuel drenching the victims. And there was plenty of that in the smoke-stained battlefield. Some clusters of firebenders and spearmen with their wits still about them tried to slow the tanks, or shoot up with the optimistic hopes of hitting the gliders. They failed utterly at both, the tanks being either surrounded by fellow troops for any degree of effective fire, and the gliders were just too high for the fire bolts to reach. Wulong could only gape in astonishment. 200 tanks, and less than half that number in gliders, were in the midst of a panicking force 70 times their size, spreading chaos so complete that they were almost halfway into the crumbling formation. The rebels' own infantry also caught up with the evaporating front, and Wulong could only sigh in defeat as he watched flames and rocks stamp out any soldier in their way. And then a dull explosion rumbled from within the enemy's center. Something tore a brutal line through the men before blowing up a good amount of dirt deep in the loyalists' formation, further fueling the rising panic. Another explosion sounded, and then another, and then another. It was the pounding rhythm of defeat in Wulong's ears. Each blast was quickly followed by a bloody line carved through the retreating formation, piercing deeper than the flame tanks could ever reach. The High General saw lines of men, simply vanishing in puffs of blood and dust at whatever that shot through them. It took a while before Wulong found the source of it all. A cart of sorts following after the infantry with a bulky form atop of it. He could barely make out a long metal tube stuck to a massive box. Each blast was heralded by a short puff of smoke and flames, and Wulong finally caught sight of a speeding projectile zipping through men and earth. It was all too much for him. This whole battle was descending into madness. At the edges of the battlefield, a number of the Komodo Rhino cavalry rallied, and to Wulong's dismay they were making their way towards the enemy's engaged center. Their charge was stopped completely as the rebels' earthbenders created a tangle of earthen spikes, impaling beasts and riders alike, and causing their luckier fellows to turn away. Then the spikes were shot out to the rest of the surprised cavalry, maiming and distracting them enough for the enemy to close in. Unsupported by tanks or infantry, and with the momentum of the charge stolen from them, the Komodo Rhino cavalry were quickly dragged down. Wulong was sure that this time, any that managed to survive would not be rallying again anytime soon. Full retreat, the High General sighed out as he began to turn to leave. Salvage what we can. With any luck, those damn tanks will run out of fuel soon. Nobody was stupid enough to suggest using the lack of fuel as an opportunity to destroy the tanks. The rest of the rebel forces were catching up, and little over half of the force were barely retaining their wits as they pulled back. Spirits alone know how it hadn't devolved into a complete rout yet, but Wulong would take whatever small mercies he could right now. Generals, Wulong couldn't help but turn back, just in time to see another, smaller wave of gliders diving towards. He barely had time to turn and take a dozen paces back when roars of flame heralded the arrival of the enemy, right in the midst of the commanders. The High General immediately recognized the armored forms of Xing and the princess, along with their retinue, their flying contraptions still in the skies and drifting away from them. "Good day, you spineless lot," the exiled princess greeted with a sharp and venomous smirk. The scorpion beside her scanned the shocked crowd before fixing his gaze on Wulong. "Ah, High General Wulong." Wulong did not like that tone at all, and quickly fell into a fire-bending stance that snapped everyone else out of their stupor, and surprise was quickly and appropriately replaced with hostility towards the intruders. The commanders and their retinue outnumbered the traitor prince and princess at least 6-1. Wulong hoped that it would be enough. AZULA allowed herself to savor the savage satisfaction at seeing the terror in the spineless nobles before her. Oh, how poorly they wore their masks of bravery. The pure joy was further heightened by her amazing first flight on the war glider. Once more, her Xing proved to be a man of great ideas by adapting the mechanist's little toy. The war gliders could support 2 to 3 riders per machine, and were kept aloft and guided by at least one firebender using bursts of flame. If the passengers were light enough, it could carry more than just a payload of naphtha bombs. Xing suggested food and supplies for emergencies, spare parts, even trap kits, to say nothing of just strapping on small barrels of blasting jelly. And to think that they might have gained this technology earlier if the idiot Qin hadn't been such a narrow-minded thug. AZULA redirected her annoyance at the deceased war minister to further fuel her disgust at the enemy before her. She found it impossible to fear their spears, nor did their fire-bending stances concern her in the slightest. Xing, polite and generous as ever, opened by offering terms. "Gentlemen, I give you this one chance. Lay down your arms and surrender. You're surrounded, brat." High General Wulong spat back with admirable bravado. "We should be the ones he didn't get to finish," as Xing cut in blandly, his cape shifting heavily as he gestured with an arm. "Then die." AZULA let out a very unprincess-like growl as she immediately launched herself at the nearest fool. The armored fop froze in his stance, with eyes wide like a startled turtle duck. Her lunging kick wiped that expression off, along with most of his face as flames burst out from her foot. The rest of her people, they were mostly pledged to Xing, but that was academic at this point. She's his princess after all, so his people were hers as well, burst into action as well. Crotchety Yama and his earthbenders stomped their feet to create spikes to impale or holes to swallow. Kylan and a select group of bloodthirsty waterbenders decapitated and punctured their victims with ice shards and water whips. And the firebenders of the lucky raffle winners from the 11th, along with Xing's loyal bodyguards, followed AZULA's lead and dove right in to engage the enemy face-to-face. They had been initially outnumbered by a significant margin, but after the initial strike, after AZULA had personally seared several faces and buried daggers into several more throats. She thought that the handicap wasn't enough. She almost laughed as she gave in to the primal joy of battle, though she had enough awareness left to not turn sharply about too much to swish her cape. Perhaps Xing was being overcautious. Perhaps they should have let all the home island's forces gather up as one. It'd give the princess more nobles to vent her rage upon. AZULA! She turned just in time to see Suki drive her sword through a noble trying to flank her. And the princess then realized just how far out she'd inadvertently separated herself from the main group. Thank you, Suki. The other girl didn't so much as glance her way, distractedly parrying a few spears as she fell in beside AZULA. I know you're having fun, but we need to regroup. I'm aware, AZULA retorted curtly, but then remembered that her bodyguard was merely doing her job. She was supposed to be an enlightened princess, not another petty noble. I'm sorry, you're right, AZULA added, more softly this time. Let's go. Suki merely nodded to show that she heard and forgave her, and the two girls fought their way back to the formation. Or they would have if said formation hadn't already caught up with the duo. The home island commanders and their retinue were barely holding back the gliding strike force, mostly due to the sheer amount of bodies being sacrificed. Decorative household guards seasoned against peasants, and the occasional burglar bravely rushed to meet Koshi and his veteran bodyguards. The latter group ruthlessly tore through the former, while maintaining their distance to both Xing and AZULA. Suki faced down pitifully average firebenders, and cut their disappointing lives short with her sword and war fan. The other Earth Dash, Water, and Firebenders reaped their own bloody tally of deluded Fire Lord loyalists, who seemed so used to dealing with civilians that they forgot what real combat was like. The noble-born officers put up an equally pathetic fight, lacking the distance required for traditional firebending. So ingrained was their orthodox training that most did their desperate best to disengage from their enemy, so that they could fall into their stances. As such, they barely got a lick of fire out before their foes were right up in their faces and murdered them. Those with weapons tried to wield them, but compared to hardened warriors like Suki, it was like pitting pickens against a porcupine. Masterwork swords and spears and axes fell from dead hands as the plainer and more practical variants wielded from the 11th simply outfought the nobles whose skills in dueling and fighting criminals proved highly inadequate. In the middle of it all, Xing was casually murdering his way towards High General Wulong. Brave men tried to stand in his way, and those brave men died screaming as their armor melted against their seared flesh. There was a visible distortion in the air around Xing that left a trail of sizzling earth where he walked, while fire bolts evaporated into nothingness trying to get close to him. Someone tried to lunge at him, but the poor fool barely managed to let out a cry as his skin and lungs froze. One last chance. Xing's voice cut through the din of one-sided combat, and those on his side graciously paused their slaughter. Surrender, High General, and deliver a message for me to the Fire Lord. I'll not dash again. Wulong didn't get to finish his sentence, as Xing pointed an open palm at the High General's face in a quick motion, and a blast of white flame erased Wulong's head and most of his upper chest, along with several of his men unfortunate enough to be standing behind him. Xing turned his head laconically at the surviving nobles. Those who wish to help me deliver my message get to live. Nearly all of the enemy dropped to their knees and prostrated themselves in that instant, begging for the scorpion's mercy. Those few who chose a defiant end were promptly granted a variety of excruciating ends. AZULA couldn't hold back a wince as Kylan forced a water whip down a captain's throat, which then expanded so fast that the poor man exploded in a bloody mess. The first message, intended for the survivors, has been made clear. The bulk of the enemy's command have either surrendered or been killed, which left the rest of the soldiery to be dealt with before they could move on to sending the next message. AZULA felt giddy excitement as her fiancé's gaze fixed onto her. Orochi, he simply said aloud. Kain, AZULA said with equal clarity. The dragons responded to their names by unfurling themselves from under the heavy capes of the prince and princess. Orochi swam out from behind Xing with a lazy rasp, while Kain let out a yip that sounded mildly bemused to AZULA's ears. Ignoring the stares from the stunned newly acquired prisoners, the princess assuaged the dragon's annoyance by gently patting Kain's head as she curled up around AZULA's neck like an overlong scarf. There. It wasn't that long a ride, was it? She cooed. Look on the bright side. This is your big reveal. Now you get to play in the open. The purr from Kain sent a pleasant vibration against Azula's neck, and the dragon then unfurled itself to fly next to its sibling and face Xing, who swept an arm across the mass of fleeing men behind him. There's several thousand men out there that's never seen a dragon. A good crowd to make your debut. Both dragons, each already almost as long as Azula was tall, let out adorable yips that sent the prostrated nobles quivering with fresh terror. Xing turned to Azula again, just as he snapped his fingers. To her surprise, Azula saw Buofeng, one of Xing's bodyguards, walk up to her with a bow and a single arrow. "Care to do the honors, my princess?" She didn't bother to hide her flattered grin. "Truly, Xing, you spoil me." Azula took both bow and arrow in her hands, and the dragons flew up behind her. "Now," Xing instructed the dragons, "try and herd them if you can. Let some run, but otherwise have fun." He then gave Azula a single, grinning nod. "You remember the words?" Of course. The princess knocked the arrow and pulled the bowstring back, royal pride insisting that she draw the warbow fully, even if it was just a symbolic gesture. Now, what was that string of nonsense Xing found amusing again? Ah, right. Ryujie Wagatekio Kurao. The arrow was loosed at the mass of panicking soldiers, and as rehearsed, the dragons darted after it, spiraling mesmerizingly around each other as they flew. Revealed to the world at last, they let out their first true roars, which sent goosebumps racing up Azula's arms and back, and froze much of the battlefield in dread and wonder. And then, for the first time in decades, thousands of people witnessed dragons' fire being exhaled. Due to their pre-juvenile sizes, only scores out of those thousands died from the flames. The dragons split up after burning a straight path, and each took one flank to burn, claw and bite as they pleased. As Xing said, it was their debut, so both dragons were keen to leave an impression. I suppose that wraps it up for us? Azula watched Yama's earthbenders and Kylan's waterbenders nod with varying degrees of satisfaction, before giving her own pleased nod. "You weren't kidding when you said you were going to make a scene," Yama remarked, glancing at the dragons every now and then. Kylan was far more sanguine in her comment. "The dragons have returned to exact their vengeance on the Fire Nation that drove them to extinction." A powerful message indeed. Hopefully powerful enough to get through the thick skulls of the home island nobles, Azula added, glancing down at the cowering men around her. "Well, I'm sure they'll realize their guilt once we feed them to Orochi and Kain," Xing said, mostly for effect. Azula played along with a bored sigh. "Remember to strip the food down. The dragons are still too young to have metal or cloth as part of their diet." She then pretended to just notice a group of fearful nobles, just to the side, and fixed her glare at them. "On an unrelated note, Xing, we should be fully disarming our prisoners right now, shouldn't we?" Despite how sharply it stung her nose, Azula found herself grinning with glee as the stench of several people shitting and pissing themselves in fear filled the air. Captain Hidateki fought back his despair as he led his men further into the woods. The colonial garrison of Suzuro had finally reaped the full bounty from days of harrying the ungrateful home island force that sought to punish their beloved princess. Hidateki had been proud that none of his men and women had shied away from acting as rear guard to buy precious time for the other colonists to flee. He'd been even more proud that his troops had managed to harass the invaders with incredibly light casualties. Until now, anyway. In the back of his mind, the captain understood that what he and his command were doing could only last so long, that they were living on borrowed time. But still, when the invading force finally had enough of the night raids and scout ambushes and trapped carts, Hidateki found it both gratifying and crushing to have the whole damned army's attention fully fixed on them. A final stand would be worse than useless, considering the severe numerical superiority. So the partisans of Suzuro fled deeper into the forest in hopes of losing their attackers. It was a vain hope, it turned out. They've been running for 4 days now, the flames nipping at their heels, with barely enough time to get a nap or even eat. And the forest was thinning out. The enemy army had enveloped the whole area and herded them all the way to the other end of the forest. Captain Hidateki would have laughed at just how pissed off the enemy commander must have been to order such overwhelming force. But he was busy trying to come up with a way for at least some of his troops to survive this. Once they reached the other side and hit the grasslands, the partisans would be easily obliterated. On the other hand, trying to put up a fight in the forest would see them all simply burn to death while the enemy happily stood back. They'll go out with a roar instead of a whimper, Hidateki decided with his resigned but determined servants of Princess Azula. They had their last meals in the evening, wailed their regrets before they slept, and then in the morning, the whole group dashed out of the forest. Hidateki bit down the dismay of seeing another damned army, one far more massive than the one at their heels, arrayed just half a mile away, while behind him the enemy firebenders urged the flames on. "This is it," he told the warriors of Suzuro as they took a short breather outside the tree line. "Brothers and sisters, we'll meet them in the open. Let them see that Princess AZULA does not employ cowards. Let them see that one colonist that these islanders sneer down at is worth 10 of their blinkered lives." 20, someone yelled out. 50, another countered, and then others joined in to raise the number higher. The roar of flames from the forest grew louder, and the haze from it became thicker as it rolled out to blanket them. Hidateki stared at the creeping smog for a second, and then willed away his dread as he addressed his men and women. "Warriors of Suzuro, it is an honor to have served alongside you. For the princess, long may she lead us. For the princess," came the cheers of the defiant partisans of Suzuro. For Princess AZULA, they doomed partisans continued chanting her name as they marched out in the open, daring the second enemy force idling in the grasslands before them to attack. Fierce pride bloomed in Hidateki's heart as none of his comrades even flinched when the massive force began to move against them. Someone gave a report of the first enemy force finally catching up from behind, but that only made everyone wish louder for Princess AZULA's well-being and longevity. The captain looked over his shoulder and found the invading force that had chased them for days rushing out from the trees as a roaring mob. They must have been far more frustrated than he had accounted for that they didn't wait to reorganize their ranks. Good. One more insult to the enemies of the princess and the colonies. He then turned his attention to the enemy in front of him, who were marching in a far more orderly fashion, almost lazily. That annoyed Hidateki, and he pledged to make this force curse his name, just as the first one had. His last breath would be saved until he saw the enemy's full frustration. As the approaching army drew closer, they finally began to pick up speed. Hidateki heard some sort of order being yelled out, and in turn called for his warriors to ready for a charge. Ostrich horse cavalry rushed ahead of the second army's rumbling advance, but they veered away from the partisans, as if there was a need to flank the paltry force. The vanguard of heavy infantry with their massive shields got close enough to make out the battle damage on their armor, and then horns began blaring, and Hidateki's resistance fighters finally slowed to a shocked stop as the banners of the army rushing at them were dropped. The royal flame of the Fire Lord fell away, and in their place rose the black dragon-pincered scorpion of Ba Sing Se. For Prince Xing and Princess AZULA, what had been a second enemy army roared as one, and they completely ran around Hidateki's warriors without slowing in the slightest. Death to the enemies of the Scorpion and Phoenix. The captain could only blink in confusion and follow their charge with his stunned eyes. Their heavy infantry crashed into the disorganized mob of the First Army with brutal results, just as the ostrich horse light cavalry swooped in to hit them at the flanks. It became less of a fight and more of an inexorable and bloody grinding of the First Army. Hidateki turned his head as he heard the loud, booming cackling of a madman somewhere in that throng of blades and fire. Only as the last ranks flowed around Hidateki and his troops did a voice call out, "Well met, good captain." Hidateki turned and found a pair of well-dressed officers, their armor clean but not pristine. It took a second before he recognized their ranks. Generals. 2 generals, a man and a woman. Thank you for your timely aid, sir, ma'am," Hidateki stammered as he remembered his manners and bowed. "None of that," the man casually replied with a disarming smile. "We're glad to be able to help such valiant allies. I take it, you're the rear guard from Suzuro." The captain nodded, ignoring the sounds of laughter and dying from behind him. Good. We've ran into your refugee train. A regiment has been dispatched to escort them to Ba Sing Se." "Thank you, sir. No need to thank us, it's the right thing to do. Not that the dolts from the home islanders would know anything about that," the other general finally said, matriarchal disdain clear in her tone. "Stupid fools talk about loyalty and duty, while forgetting the contributions of the princess and shamelessly accusing Prince Xing and Prince Iroh of treason." "Pardon my wife," the first general said with faux placation. "The orders she received from the home islands were most unreasonable. They asked me to deliver your head," she snapped angrily, but he seemed unperturbed. "That was one of the options," he agreed. though admittedly the other options were not as palatable either. Not palatable? They all but threatened my family and yours. The first general inclined his head in a placating fashion. And no doubt if there's any strand of political sense in them, that's all they can do until we reach the home islands, where they can finally use our family as hostages. And besides, didn't you wish your relatives to experience some hardships? Hidateki stared at the two generals, and only as they continued to go back and forth did it finally click. Husband-wife, why your General Sho and General Wa. General Sho gave a genial smile, and even General Wa's lips turned up a little. I see we've got a reputation. It was the first time the captain saw the storied generals in the flesh, the few commanders out in the continent that dutifully guarded the colonies and aided the princess in bringing prosperity and stability to the continent. Theirs were names ranked closely to the princess and the scorpion. Oi, Sho! Hidateki turned to see a burly commander walk in, stained and dripping in gore from head to toe. Even his smile was stained red. Hidateki saw the axes rested casually on the man's shoulders, and with the context he was given, identified Colonel Dao, the thunder of war and the great patron of tea-house girls all across the colonies. Fighting's over. The bastards are running back into the forest, like you said they would. Despite General Wa frowning with heavy disapproval, her counterpart was uncaring about the total lack of respect. Any sign of their baggage train? Not yet. Yashin's men are pushing into the woods to find it. And casualties. We got a light scratch. They got reamed with a Komodo rhino's dash. Remember yourself, Colonel. General Wa admonished sternly, and the great thunder shut up, though looking not a bit ashamed. Hidateki then had the unique experience of being the focus of Colonel Dao's gore-smeared attention. You the guy who led the fighting? Yes, sir. Dao walked up, and Hidateki found himself craning his head up at the man towering over him like a dark spirit of violence. You held them back for days, more than a week. How? The captain found himself fighting off the urge to shrink away. We conducted hit-and-run night raids on their exposed elements, silencing their scouts. Hidateki felt a tingle of apprehension as Dao continued to stare at him. The weight of the man's judgmental gaze was overwhelming. A spike of fear stabbed into the captain. Was he about to get berated for adopting such tactics? And it kept you alive so far. Hidateki could only gulp and nod. And then a bloody, armored hand flew out to smack him on the back with such force that Hidateki almost fell forwards. Good man. The princess really does foster good talent. Spirits. You're a colonel, Dao. Act like it. This time General Wa was much sharper in her scolding. Calm your tits, woman. We're among friends. Hidateki didn't catch the blur of movement. But suddenly the frostfire was standing before him, and Colonel Dao was down on his knees, clutching his groin with a pitiful whimper. This time, Hidateki did shrink away when Wa's gaze fell on him. Forgive the oaf for his crassness, Captain. Clearly, the home islands are not the only ones stuck with idiots in their ranks. There was nothing to forgive, but Hidateki nodded anyway. Anyway, you and your people can rest and resupply in our camp for the day. Then you can continue to the safety of Ba Sing Se. What about you? Hidateki had to ask. We'll continue pursuing this force, General Sho declared firmly. Eradicate them, and if the ships are not around, raise the depot they'll no doubt have built in your colony. It'll be one less thorn in the prince and princess side. Hear, hear, Dao weakly agreed as he rose to his feet. Hidateki looked at the generals, and then to the garrison-turned-partisans he led. The looks in his comrades' eyes told him enough, and he turned back to General Sho with matching resolve. We'd like to join you. Neither general tried to dissuade him. Instead, Sho gave his wife a thoughtful look. Having people familiar with the local terrain would be useful, especially when it comes to urban combat. One nodded in agreement, and then fixed Hidateki with another intimidating look. Are you sure of this, Captain? Hidateki, Captain Hidateki, ma'am. Yes, we're sure. Then welcome to the 1st Continental Army. We'll find a place for you and your people, and you'll have the chance to enact vengeance for your homes. Hidateki nodded dumbly and simply did as he was told for now. He was a mere garrison captain, and now he'd be fighting alongside the folk heroes of the colonies. What's next? Meet a dragon in the flesh? Still nothing from the continent? Nothing, Zuko answered with a rueful shake of his head as he sat on the bed. Beside him, Mai's usual mask of indifference cracked for a split second to reveal her irritation and worry. It might be barely a month since AZULA, Xing and Uncle Iroh were declared traitors. But even so, Zuko would have expected a trickle of updates from the Earth continent. The last bit of news they've gotten was the majority of the colonies joining AZULA in rebellion and evacuating their homes. But not before scorched earthing the towns and villages in a despicable act of self-sabotage. Zuko remembered that being one of the contingencies against an Earth Kingdom resurgence, he should have expected it to be used against the Fire Nation as well. It was a more effective tactic here as well, since the Fire Nation would have to rely on sea routes to establish supply lines. And with how the colonies were spread out, that'd be a lot of lines to safeguard. Should the Earth Kingdom or Water tribes finally wise up to that fact, it would take very little to cause a dent in the punitive forces supply chain. And no doubt Xing would have his own plans to exploit the stretched Fire Nation Navy. He knew how the Navy worked just as well as the Army, and the loyalties of the admirals were not as heavily considered as the generals. A careless mistake caused by a careless assumption on his father's and his advisor's part. Zuko was sure that once the month was over, if the sea lanes were still running untouched, it would only be because Xing saw it fit to leave them alone. So it's just another day of nothing? Mai asked, her annoyance leaking through her facade. Not exactly, Zuko answered with a shrug. He glanced to the door and windows, and further softened his whisper. You could say that no news is good news for AZULA. Mai leaned in, and with the candlelight accenting her features, the prince had to make an effort to not drop his train of thought in exchange for just staring at her. My father's court will surely seize any victory to bolster support and legitimacy, and reporting any defeats would work against public sentiment. Mai nodded in understanding. It made her dress shift rather nicely against her frame. So, either nothing's really happening, or whatever's going on is not something the palace wants to know. Exactly. The usually dark girl broke into a rare, spite-filled smile. I guess it serves them right for underestimating your sister. Zuko heartily agreed. The time he spent in the 11th further enlightened the prince to how Xing operated, which, by extension, was how AZULA did as well. They were not ones to just roll over and die, unless that gesture was meant as a grand trap. AZULA might have lost her temper at their father's ridiculous accusation against Xing and Uncle Iroh, but the fact that a quarter of the palace's staff vanished with her, with not a single conspirator caught yet up until now, showed just how deep-rooted her preparations were. Some in the Fire Lord's council worried that she might have more agents sown across the islands. Zuko took that for granted. His sister did not laze around during her tenure as colonial minister. Her influence in the capital was limited, but only in the royal court. Beyond the palace walls and within the city, Zuko's short time with her told him that she operated a variety of cells that looked into keeping an eye on and occasionally undermining political rivals. There was no doubt that those cells were still around. Just because none of them were acting up simply meant that AZULA hadn't activated them yet. She could incite a citywide riot, a string of assassinations, even poisoning the water, and, what are you thinking? Mai's question snapped Zuko out of his thoughts, and he shrugged weakly at her. Just wondering what will happen once she returns here. The look she gave him was more curious than doubtful. Nothing good. If we're lucky, she'll come with company, and they'll hold her back from doing her worst. There was a few seconds of silence as Mai digested the words, and then she of course asked, and if we're not lucky, a lot of people are going to die. Probably slowly too. Your father might be one of them. It'd be what he deserves, Mai huffed, though Zuko knew she didn't mean it. Despite blaming Akano for having her family kept as prisoners in all but name in the palace grounds, Mai still loved her father enough that she didn't wish him dead. Exiled maybe, but not dead. Especially not by AZULA's hands. Or Xing's, which is definitely worse. Zuko still remembered the stories the soldiers shared of the young dragon's time before being colonel. There were a lot of nightmarish castrations and eviscerations in them. Well, on the bright side, at least she should know we're not involved. Zuko didn't bother hiding his enthusiasm in his nodding. Yeah, that's one thing we dash. A noise from the door caused both teens to freeze up and snap their heads towards it. Zuko shared a tense look with Mai before he quietly got up and stalked over. He was sure that him sneaking into Mai's room these past few nights was noticed by the palace sentries and tolerated by the Fire Lord. But considering what led to this point, things could dramatically change. Zuko edged closer to the door, thanking the 11th's night training for keeping his movements utterly silent, and carefully placed his ear against it. Not a sound. Then he slowly brought his head down to the bottom of the door, peeking through the gaps in it. He saw dark shapes of feet shifting skittishly. He got up, and after gesturing for Mai to move away from the door's immediate line of sight, Zuko quickly opened it and found a young woman in a servant's dress staring in surprise at him. "Who are you?" Zuko whispered harshly, eyes darting about for guards and finding none. This servant must have waited for the patrols to clear the area. "A message for Lady Mai," the woman simply said, offering up a folded piece of paper. She too looked about, and after pushing the paper into Zuko's hands, scampered off with surprising quietness. Zuko looked at the note before closing the door and heading to a very curious Mai. "What is it?" He unfolded the paper and, as expected, found a message within. Passing it to Mai, they both huddled together, and Zuko did his level best not to think too much about it, to read it beside the candlelight. "Remember the turtle ducks, the flying Komodo rhino. When the laughter stops, see to the dawn." It was a jumble of words strung together to form nonsense. But then both of them figured out the underlying pattern. It was a cipher that used particular brushstrokes of each character to hide the true message. One of AZULA's ciphers, that both Zuko and Mai were familiar with in their travels with the princess. "Half moon," Mai read out in the barest of whispers. "The pond garden. Escorts come." A simple enough message. Mai looked to Zuko with a glint of hope in her eyes, but he regrettably crushed it. "It's a trap." "What?" Zuko sighed, and thanked the spirits that Mai didn't crack as badly as he expected her to. "It's AZULA's cipher, and written in the same style, but she only used it for communicating with the colonies, remember? Mostly for updating on news, not for anything important." Admirably, Mai caught on immediately and nodded with a dark frown. "And it's the only one whose manual she keeps lying around. As bait. They must have found it," Zuko said needlessly. Mai gave an ugly scowl as stared at the letter. "A test? Likely so. And a very bad one, too. Using a servant was a nice touch, but in hindsight AZULA would not have needlessly risked her people in a high-security place like this. And at night of all things, when it was arguably the riskiest for a servant to be out. She'd probably have the message delivered in their food or something instead. Maybe even use the 11th's cricket song. So what do we do?" Zuko was in his room and heard the news from a guard the next morning. Mai brought it up with the guards, making a show of pointing out their lousy security that allowed some madman to drop her a nonsensical letter. It meant that security was increased to the point that it took Zuko twice as long now to sneak into Mai's room, a whopping 40 minutes. But hopefully it'd also sell the fact that the two of them were ignorant of AZULA's inner workings. Beyond that, nothing much else changed. Zuko was still confined to the palace wing his room was in. Mai was on the opposite end with her family, just barely tolerating the presence of her father, and neither received any information about the world beyond the walls. Zuko had not seen his father ever since his captivity, and the constant shuffling of servants and guards ensured that he couldn't establish any rapport to build up an information network. It was a strong gilded cage that he was stuck in, especially with the use of Mai and her family as a shackle. But the prince could barely feel despair. Compared to the tribulations he faced during his exile, the oh-so-close victories that were turned into bitter defeats, this was nothing. He'd been stuck on a ship for years in a fruitless search for the Avatar. Being confined to his room would be nothing. And besides, it wasn't like he didn't know what the outcome would be. Xing would be landing on the capital city to depose the Fire Lord. Zuko was sure of it. The question was whether Zuko was prepared to lose his father. Well, there were plenty of days left to consider that matter, and maybe even grieve beforehand. With the once prosperous colonies falling into civil war, business was bad all around, except for certain areas. While most traders either fled to Ba Sing Se or the newly freed Earth Kingdom states to rebuild, Jay Choi found himself in a unique position of profiting while contributing to his patron's cause. The Cabbage Food and Logistics Company had built itself an impressive network of depots and stores throughout the colonies and the neighboring Earth Kingdom states, almost entirely thanks to the generosity of Princess AZULA. The lack of trade tariffs within the Fire Nation territories meant that Jay Choi had the luxury of investing in transportation and storage technologies to maximize his profits. His company's fleets of wagons and carts and civilian-grade tanks that once ensured mass transportation of perishable goods to their destinations in a timely manner now served as the trading backbone of Ba Sing Se. Goods were exported and imported in long trains to and from the states aligned with Omashu. From what Jie Choi understood, King Bumi was keeping his hands off further interactions with Ba Sing Se beyond the peace treaty. But that also included not stopping or encouraging trade. Ba Sing Se offered its massive surplus of grains in exchange for other foodstuffs, and the gold that won decorated the palace and nobles' homes in the inner ring were offered up to purchase metal and leather and textiles. Even the deposed Earth King's wardrobe was sold off. There was enough gold thread separated from green and yellow silks to make several tightly wound spools. The resources Prince Xing imported would either go on to elevate the populace's diet or feed the new industry of war. Metal ingots were transformed into spear and arrowheads. Leather and silk were woven into light armor. Even animal dung was refined into manure, or the infamous naphtha. It was a pity the Cabbage Food and Logistics Company had no naval department. Otherwise, Jie Choi could have better insight into Ba Sing Se's trade relations with the Northern Water Tribe. Apparently, portions of the weapons and armor made in the city were sent north, in exchange for an influx of blubber and furs and seafood. A northern branch would definitely be worth exploring. Once the fighting was all done with, anyway. In the meantime, Jie Choi kept organizing his caravans, and occasionally led convoys to evacuate the few towns and villages still untouched by the invading Fire Nation brutes, which could lead to unfortunate situations. Leave the caravan and be thankful that you have contributed to the Fire Nation's cause. Situations like this one. Jie Choi sighed as he ordered his men to comply with the rude demands. Nothing more than terrorists, these Fire Nation soldiers. Not like the more courteous one the princess had roaming the roads during her reign. The trade magnate watched bemusedly as the soldiers swarmed his caravan full of food, barely keeping a scowl of his face at the thought of their grubby hands getting on provisions meant for the needy and the desperate. He calmed himself by listening to the crickets around him sing. "What's a rich merchant like you doing around these parts?" the commander sneered as he marched up to Jie Choi. "Food delivery," he answered curtly, biting back his own sneer as he kept an ear on the crickets chirping. The commander with the stupid-looking skull helmet tilted his head in mock amusement. "That's so. I don't see any major colonies along this road. It's for selling to the settlements along the route." "Heh, and which bountiful farms did you get all of this from?" Jie Choi stared the man right in the eyes. "The farms of Ba Sing Se, realm of Prince Xing and Princess AZULA." The commander reacted by going stiff and gurgling, as 2 arrows shot through his neck, and 3 more bounced off his helmet. Other boorish soldiers fell by the wagons, some managing to cry out in surprise as the arrows studded their necks and exposed underarms. With the ambush triggered, the traitor drew his own blade, hidden in his voluminous sleeves, and jammed it right into the eye hole of a soldier standing beside the fallen commander. His staff too burst into action, revealing daggers and short swords to lunge at the confused looters. Normally, for all the bravery, such an ambush would be disastrous due to the fact that it was mere civilians against a larger group of soldiers. Thankfully for Jie Choi, the civilians like him were only the very well-protected bait. Bolts of fire joined the arrows in picking out the enemy. And then the comforting forms of the 11th burst out of the ground and down from the treetops to swarm their prey. The male-veiled figures charged in like a wave of violence, sometimes literally pouncing on their victims to bury their blades into necks or faces. Jie Choi barely had time to watch as his own victim's comrade turned his spear at him, because the earth under the potential attacker folded up and crushed him into a gory paste. Just off to his side, another poor brute screamed as he fought against a wagon driver pinning him down, while the driver's assistant bit on a cleaver and struggled to liberate the soldier of his helmet. The helm came off seconds later, and the cleaver came down several times after that. The convoy staff and the soldiers of the 11th worked together to bring a quick and bloody end to the fighting, resulting in no losses on their end save for a few crates of vegetables being stained with blood and gore. Well, the losses were still well within the margins. Another successful run. Captain Weikong greeted with a smile as the corpses were being looted. Jie Choi smiled back. "Very much so. Only 4 crates of food lost. MHM. So for ambushes in, you're hesitating far less." Indeed, Jie Choi did have his doubts after he recklessly volunteered his services in a fit of loyalty and bravado. But now, after killing his eighth foe, the traitor had to admit it was rather satisfying repaying the prince's and princess' generosity this way. Prince Xing had saved him from a bloody end once. It was only fitting to repay blood with blood, as the old proverb goes. Plus, it got Jie Choi's old resentment out of his system. All those times being pushed around by both Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom bullies. Here's to hoping we get stopped again before we reach our next stop, Jie Choi remarked sincerely. I'll have the scouts keep a lookout for choice prey, the captain replied with a chuckle. Jie Choi bowed his head in thanks. While we're waiting for your men to finish their task, should I have mine prepare a light snack? Cabbage and lotus root soup? Ah, how good it was to have such an eager customer who appreciated the classics. With tofu and ostrich horse bones. Captain Wakong smirked. You spoil us with such luxury, cabbage merchant. For better or worse, the rest of the journey was uneventful. Though the refugees that replaced the crates of food in the wagons on the way back still made the trip worthwhile. Saving a future customer base was an investment that was sure to pay off in the future. Aang was aware that he was having trouble being anything but glum. It was supposed to be a joyful, relieving experience, not being the last airbender, but instead, the happy reunion the Avatar imagined upon visiting the village of hidden clouds failed to materialize. The older folks in particular, children of the first Air Temple's refugees, had offered nothing but scorn and disgust. Why'd it take you until now to show up? Why weren't you there to push back the Fire Nation before they drove us to extinction? It's already 100 years. Why are you still running about mastering the elements? What could Aang say? What answer could he possibly give beside the shameful fact that he'd been missing because he ran away? Hey, lay off him. Toph had stepped in with a scowl, jabbing a finger at the accusers. You don't know what he's been through. Katara joined in with protective anger. Aang's been through a lot already, and he's trying to make up for it. Yeah, then why's he here if he's got a lot to make up for? The century-long vacation not enough. The older villagers retorted with more hateful words, and it had taken Iroha's and Bumi's intervention, along with the intervention of the younger villagers, to stop the airbenders from clashing with the infuriated Katara, Toph, and Sokka. Only when Xing's soldiers stepped in to escort them away from the village did tension cool off. Of course, being friends, the gang insisted that Aang should not take any of the villagers' words to heart. The old hermits were being unfair. Iroh and Bumi also advised him to not let the harsh reception dissuade him. Sometimes some wounds will never fade and will instead fester, Iroh said. And the elderly have far more time to ferment their bitter resentment. Do not let such guilt stop you from continuing with your life. They may not wish your forgiveness now, but strive to better yourself, to undo the wrongs you've made, and perhaps it might soften their hearts. Otherwise, don't do it for them, Bumi added. Do it to prove to yourself that you're not what they accuse you of. Aang stayed away from the village of hidden clouds after that, and struggled to keep the sour encounter out of his mind. He plunged into further refining his bending, as well as learning the basics of domestic and international intrigue. The history lessons provided by Iroh and Bumi, reinforced by tomes taken from Boss Sing Se's libraries, at least served as adequate distraction. Katara and Sokka joined in with those studies, but Toph seemed focused on locking herself in a metal box for some reason. Some attention was also spent with other familiar faces. It eased Aang's mind to see Teo walking like he's never been in a wheelchair before. That Xing had been responsible was not an issue. Hearing the other boys' reluctance about working with the Scorpion was refreshing, as was having Teo's father introduce Aang to new inventions like the flush toilet, the new monorail cars that ran on modified Fire Nation boiler engines, and the ambitious plans to rework Ba Sing Se's sewer and tunnel systems. Those meetings, along with the lessons, helped occupy Aang's thoughts, but only after Xing returned from his battle in triumph did something show up to eclipse the sour memories of the hidden village. Show me your progress. And just like that, Aang had something far more important to worry about, namely his well-being. Xing promised not to use his heat bending like he did the last time. But from what Aang learned of the 11th, the friendly duel was not going to be pleasant. They stood at opposite ends of the sparring ring on the day after Xing returned, and Aang fought off the trembling of nerves and the suggest flare of phantom pain from the last time he lost to the Scorpion. There was a deep, primal fear that gnawed at the airbender, but Aang forced it back with sheer will, just as Bumi had told him to. It worked somewhat. And begin. Sokka quickly scrambled back, as both Avatar and Scorpion burst into action. Aang stomped his foot to send out a wave of rocky spikes, while his arms weaved to deliver a flurry of wind blades. A blast of white fire tore through both attacks, and the airbender was already moving and delivering a storm of jagged hailstones to distract Xing while he got into a better position. The scorpion dragon charged into the hailstorm with a wave of fire leading the way, closing the distance to Aang. More blinding bolts of flame was hurled that threatened to hem Aang into one spot. A quick pulse of chi into the ground sent the Avatar flying up well above the projectiles. Aang almost had enough time to form a pleased grin, but then he was forced to desperately twist aside as Xing flew straight at him. Aang just barely got out of the way, but the scorpion's leg lashed out at the last minute to clip him across the shoulder and send him spinning down to the ground. Remembering his lessons, Aang fought through the spike of pain with a growl as he pushed himself away right as he landed, avoiding the axe kick that would have shattered his spine. The earth tremor his hand created as he rolled away managed to catch Xing off guard, causing the prince to stumble and almost fall over. It still bought enough time for Aang to get back onto his feet, so he wasn't going to complain. The two teens faced off again, but at a much closer distance this time. Xing's features were stony and serious, which in turn made Aang frown just as seriously. Xing sent out a lance of fire, which Aang blocked by raising up the whole sparring ground between them. He also used the momentary break in vision to dive into the improvised tunnel the raised earth created. Then it became a guessing game. Aang's tremor sense was nowhere near as good as Toph's, but he did learn how to at least pick up vibrations, if not tell where exactly they came from. The Avatar forced himself to calm his nerves and focus, counting the little tremors that thrummed against his body. He waited a particular strong pulse before sending the earth above him blasting up, and to Aang's fierce satisfaction, he saw Xing being thrown up into the air amidst the cloud of dirt and dust. That did not mean he dawdled, though. Aang knew better than to think Xing would need so much time to retaliate, so he sent out more wind blades to keep his opponent occupied as he charged in. Xing was already snuffing out the attacks with bursts of flame as he landed, and he braced himself just in time to spew out a burst of fire that negated a powerful blast of wind, ice, and rocks. Aang wanted to complain about how unfair Xing's firebending was. He really wanted to scream his annoyance at that, but Xing was already charging at him, so the Avatar frantically skipped back to create more distance, using air and earth to propel him. Xing caught up with an explosion from his feet, and this time Aang was prepared to deliver a gust of wind to knock him down from the air. The prince tumbled through the ground, but he rolled to his feet in short order, and still managed to dodge the flurry of projectiles Aang sent as a follow-up. The scorpion made another charge, this time with a wide fire wall leading the way. It carried enough heat and energy to shatter the earthen barrier Aang hastily erected, and by the time the airbender banished the fiery wave with his airbending, another had appeared right behind it. Thinking fast, Aang leapt up and above the fire wall, just as he did the last time against Xing's previous attack. He knew it was a mistake the moment pain exploded all across his body. Xing had shot up right as he sent the second fire wave, intercepting Aang just as he rose above it. The scorpion's shoulder slammed into the unprepared Avatar's chest, blasting the air from Aang's lungs. His lungs almost exploded when he crashed back to the ground, back first, with all the weight of Xing on him. Aang didn't have the air or strength left to yield, but thankfully Xing helped him up to show that the fight was over. Not bad moves, but try to keep to the ground instead of jumping into the air. You're less vulnerable strafing sideways than in midair. Aang barely caught any of the advice as he was carried over to Katara, who was already scolding Xing. He did latch onto the scorpion's next words, though, and they filled Aang with satisfaction as he gave into his exhaustion. If not for our plans involving the eclipse, I'd say we can send him over to Ozai right now to beat the Fire Lord into pulp. Unfortunately, those encouraging approval didn't stop Xing from getting Bumi and Iroh into training Aang harder. The days that followed saw the Avatar hone his bending by sparring against the venerable earth and firebenders, as well as other volunteers. Valuable lessons were imparted by words as much as painful strikes. Aang understood and appreciated the growth he was being put through, but it didn't stop him from begrudging Xing for the ruthless regime. It only occurred to him much later that the grueling sparring day after day made Aang forget about the village of hidden clouds. I'm a bounty hunter, not a mercenary. There's a difference. June reigned in her exasperation as she explained her profession to a leering Fire Nation captain. Just her luck to be stuck deep in the colonies, just as they decided to fight among themselves. She tried to quietly sneak out, but inevitably she ran into a small cavalry force from the Fire Nation Islands. The invading force, as the fleeing locals have put it. Invaders or not, June found them to be a chore to deal with. If not for Nyla being the opposite of remarkable, she'd have snuck her way to the fragmented Earth Kingdom by now. The jobs might be shit there, but better shit jobs than no jobs. Treat this like a bounty then. We'll pay you for every enemy commander you lead us to. Or shittier jobs like being hired to be a scout for the invading force. Could she say no? Sure, but it might mean having to avoid more Fire Nation groups in the future and risk a bounty being placed on her head for a change. The irony was not lost to her, as were the rumors of the invading Fire Nation's tendency for having a poor temper. It's what you get for not getting the welcome you expect. But June couldn't really comment on internal Fire Nation affairs. Also, the captain had a very different idea on how Nyla operated. There's bound to be a few scraps in the ruins you can use. Just use your beast to sniff out a captain or general, and we'll do the fighting once you lead us to them. I'm sure you can sniff out for future trouble as well, which will be most helpful. It's not. Arguing would be pointless. June had dealt with such imbeciles before, thinking that Nyla could just smell whatever they wanted her to smell. But she usually had the option of just leaving the idiots instead of straining her sanity unnecessarily. Here, with 100 or so soldiers on ostrich horses armed with spears and bows around her, telling the captain to F himself might not be the best of options. So June sighed and opted for Plan B. Fine. Which ruins? The captain gave a pleased nod and shot a thumb over his shoulder. There's an abandoned village just a bit back. My men will guide you to it. A village? The villagers left a while ago. I'm sure if you pick up a scent and follow it, it'll lead you to whatever traders that are escorting them. With the level of coordination these rebels are showing, they're bound to be organized by a general or something. Wrong. The villagers likely just upped and left for Ba Sing Se because their princess told them to. June met similar refugee groups and hadn't found a single soldier among them. Maybe the local garrison or patrol as escorts, but nothing so organized like the captain was thinking. Still, best to humor the dumb prick. June followed her escorts to the village, effortlessly ignoring their pathetic stares. She had Nyla roam around the village and snuck out Plan B from her belt pouch. June then made a show of finding a tattered rag and offering it to her Shirshu to lock in the scent. Then, with Nyla rearing and eager for the hunt, the bounty hunter returned to the captain and led them through the colony's well-maintained roads with all due haste. The captain sent messengers back to the main force, of course, but June didn't care for that. She had a glimpse of the message. Typical greed meant that the captain left her involvement out of the coming chase to ensure that he got all the credit. Good for him, better for her. They traveled for days, and June was patient enough to let the soldiers stop for long breaks. An army marches on its stomach and all that, after all. And it's not like she was that tight on a schedule. It took them 5 days before the captain figured that something was amiss. Are we heading north? Hey, the scent leads to Ba Sing Se, obviously. But I thought we'd have caught up to them by now. June managed to shrug her shoulders nonchalantly. Hey, you asked me to follow the scent. I'm following it. Suspicions raised, but not fully alerted. The captain grumbled a bit, but they continued on. The cavalry group grew more nervous as each day took them closer to Ba Sing Se. Finally, after 2 weeks of putting up with shit company and stupid invitations into tents, June heard the sweet, sweet sound of crickets. A few more days, and they'd be seeing the great walls of Ba Sing Se. She brought the whole force to a stop at the edge of a forest, and the confused captain rode up beside her. So what? We still haven't caught up to them. Serpent's Pass is just past this forest. Not my problem, she reminded him. I'm hired to trail a scent, so here we are. Here we are, the captain echoed, and then looked around. The trail ends here? June couldn't help grinning viciously at the pompous fool. For you it does. Fire shot out from the shadows of the treetops, knocking the captain off his ostrich horse even as his face was burned away. Arrows and more bolts of fire rained onto the surprised Fire Nation cavalry, killing dozens of riders and steeds. Even June was surprised when the earth rumbled to erupt around the survivors, walling them off from escaping. And then Plan B made themselves known, a small group of different Fire Nation soldiers, with Earthbenders now apparently, stalking out of the forest, taking their time and shooting down every single last rider. Then, when the last invader was thrown to the ground by arrow or flame, the score or so hunters drew their daggers and made sure of their kills, all except for one particular man in leathers and small metal plates. He walked over to June with a swagger of familiarity. For her part, the bounty hunter put on an air of faux annoyance. "Took you long enough. I thought you'd be further west, near the Great Divide." "You're lucky I'm here in the first place," the man greeted. "We're stretched thin, so it's common sense that we pull our borders back." June got off Nyla as the man walked up beside the Shershu, and after exchanging hard stares for several seconds, both bounty hunter and hunter broke into warm smiles and embraced. "I'm glad you're doing well, June. Thanks for showing up, Uncle Sungo." They broke from the hug after a moment, with the 11th's scout captain grinning eagerly. "So, you ready to work in a real job? I've still got that opening for you. Comes with a neat house with a view too." June sighed and rolled her eyes. Uncle. Coming to him for help was Plan B for a reason. Her uncle was too traditionally minded, who believed that military service, commerce or owning farmland was what constituted honest work. Really, June was making a good living doing what she enjoyed. She didn't need her uncle saving her from a rough life, just as her father didn't need his brother constantly nagging him to apply for military duty. Yeah, it's not a phase, it's a lifestyle," Uncle Sungo said and let the matter drop. At least he wasn't being too overbearing, which was why he's Plan B, and not C or, spirits forbid, D. And he was just trying to look out for her, which was a sentiment June appreciated. Still, for the little boost in business her uncle recommended her way, June still did owe it to her uncle. "Well, with business all but ruined thanks to the new batch of warring, do you think there's any bounties to be taken in Ba Sing Se?" Uncle Sungo lit up at the question. "I'm sure there's some hidden fugitives to be found in that city. Might even pay almost as much as the standard dash." "Ah crap," she got him going again. June cut him off before he tried to convince her of the wonders of a full-time job again. "We'll wait until your men are ready to go." The remains of the cavalry force were buried by the Earthbenders, and Scout Captain Sungo left a few sentry squads behind before he returned to Ba Sing Se to deliver his report and help set up his niece in the city. He'd failed to convince her out of the unstable life of bounty hunting, but at least he got her working in a safer environment for the time being. "Suki, join us, please." The royal couple had just finished breakfast and the morning briefings when AZULA gave the sudden request. Despite her puzzlement, Suki followed the princess and Xing into the royal bedroom. Usually she'd be standing watch outside with the other bodyguards, pointedly ignoring the bumps and crashes and fiery bursts that leaked out. Xing said a word to the other bodyguards outside before he locked the door behind them as AZULA turned to squarely face Suki. "As you know, the big day will be coming soon," she began with an even seriousness. The near monotone of her voice made Suki worry. "You've been a good friend and a reliable bodyguard thus far." However, AZULA paused for a second to stare straight into Suki before sighing the rest of the sentence out. "I've only recently realized that you might not have been properly incentivized and rewarded for your selfless aid." Confusion swept against Suki's mind for a few seconds as she processed the words. Was AZULA suddenly having doubts about her loyalty? What brought this on? "It's not a dash," the princess cut off her words with a raise of her hand. "No, it's not all right. We'll be heading into combat again, and you'll be tasked with ensuring my well-being. My life will likely be in your hands, and your life will be dependent on how much of a threat the enemy perceives me to be. I would be a poor employer and a poorer friend if I did not acknowledge the great risk you're putting yourself in." So AZULA wasn't doubting her loyalty, but feeling bad about Suki's role as bodyguard? This was getting more puzzling by the minute. "So, Suki," the princess' eyes narrowed into an intense stare, and Xing stood beside her with an unreadable expression. "How much do you like Xing?" It took seconds before the Kyoshi warrior realized her jaw had dropped, and she was staring with eyes boggled at AZULA. And then Suki began to blush against her will, and her gaze instinctively averted from Xing. "Answer the question, Suki." "Honestly, I." Her eyes flickered to the prince's neutral gaze, and then returned to AZULA's more patient attention. "I'm not dash," the princess let out a great sigh. "Remember what I said earlier about Xing? The one where he's off limits? I've rescinded that. So do you like Xing?" "I don't dash fine, if it's going to be this difficult." Shing, are you sure of this? Uncertainty finally peeked through in his otherwise stony expression, and Suki felt a pang of panic. Azula's answer was nonchalant as she nodded to Suki. I am. You should be asking her that. There was an urge to shrink away as Shing's gaze rested on Suki, but she remained rooted to the spot, even as he took a few steps closer towards her. Suki, please look at me. She couldn't deny his voice. Suki's nerves were alight with uncanny embarrassment as she met the scorpion's gaze. He raised an open hand and slowly brought it towards her face. A great part of Suki's mind screamed for her to run, but she remained transfixed, her attention shifting between his fathomless golden eyes and his hand. May I? He asked softly, and Suki found her view bobbing up and down as she nodded without thinking. The contact on her cheek was oh so gentle, as if he were inspecting a fragile piece of glass. Suki heard herself gulp and the blood rushed through her ears. She should lean into his slow caress, or hold his hand, or do something, anything, instead of being as still as a statue. At the corner of her vision, noted AZULA, with her arms folded in front of her, rolling her eyes. Oh, for spirit's sake. Suki, Shing is going to kiss you. Not if you want it or dash. Suki was already licking her lips and nodding dumbly before the sentence finished. See, it's not that hard. Shing's lopsided smirk sent a giddy tingle rushing down and swirling in her chest. Her eyes remained wide and fixed on the prince as he leaned in. Her chest thrummed from her rapidly beating heart. Her breath became shallower the closer he got, and her mind's coherency crumbled away. Then his lips brushed against hers, and then pressed against them. Suki somehow managed to stiffen some more as she closed her eyes. Her toes curled and hands balled into fists. She couldn't untense herself, otherwise she might melt into a puddle of embarrassment and delight. His lips began to move, and the tension snapped when Suki heard herself make a most unseemly sound. Shing's strong, neck-crushing hands were on her shoulders then, propping her up as the Kyoshi warrior remembered to breathe, and her limbs went slack with relief and something else. The kiss lasted for wondrous seconds before Shing pulled away, leaving Suki gasping softly and staring longingly at him. I hope you liked it, he asked once he drew back enough for her to take in his smile. It was a very, very nice smile. Was it always that soft and gentle? Why? Embarrassment kicked in as her brain still struggled to reconnect with her body. But Shing's hand lightly rested on her cheek to stop her from turning away. It was all too easy then to be lost in his eyes. Good. She almost mewled when his fingers began moving slowly against her face. Well, Suki, as AZULA said, we wish to acknowledge your selfless deeds and your friendship. So, we've been talking, and we've agreed to extend you an invitation. Suki gave a quiet nod, still not trusting herself to speak just yet. Shing's hand fell away, and then AZULA's was suddenly lightly pulling her attention over to her. Would you be interested in joining us, Suki? The princess asked in a curious, probing tone. It'd mean sharing. Bodyguard and princess exchanged deep, questing stares for a moment. The current flux of emotions in Suki unlocked for her a greater appreciation of AZULA's looks. She'd always known for an objective fact that the princess was pretty, but right here, right now, with the giddy tingle running circles in Suki's head, AZULA's sharp features and her keen, commanding eyes seemed more than just pretty. Admiration of the princess' competence bloomed into something, and then AZULA leaned in, and Suki was far less stiff this time, though there was also far less noise made. Surprisingly, it only felt a little different from Shing's, and only a little less pleasant. Not less pleasant, less intense. Maybe it was her mind recomposing itself. Maybe it's because AZULA's lips were softer, but her movements were firmer, more demanding. Her grip on Suki's shoulders was also not as reassuring as Shing's, but it was still enjoyable nonetheless. Suki still felt disappointment when the princess ended the kiss. It'd take time getting used to this new avenue of pleasantness, but Suki found herself looking forward to it. AZULA tossed an enigmatic smirk at Shing's direction before returning her attention to Suki. Do you think you'll need much time to consider the invitation? It was a rhetorical question. The trio established some promises, and they also agreed to hash out the finer details later, to give Suki more time to consider her stance, as well as clear her head a little. What was important was that she now had a reservation in the young royal family. Suki left with a light heart, ignorant to the fact that she was practically skipping off to her room to take a break that involved burying her face in her pillow and screaming her joy into it. She also didn't notice Koshi and the other bodyguards giving her a second's glance, and a couple of them letting out sighs before tossing pouches to their fellows. That was better than expected. Which part? Xing asked with bright amusement. The one where you kissed Suki, or the one where you basically have her tied to us? Don't be cynical about it, AZULA chided as she absently brushed at her lips with her thumb. I appreciate Suki as more than a friend now, but she's more than a mere pawn. Besides, we're above the petty games of nobles and fire lords, aren't we? That's true, Xing conceded as he walked up beside her and wrapped an arm around his princess' shoulder. But yes, she was nice. AZULA gave her fiancé a thoughtful look. Different from you, but still nice. A part of her also wondered if Xing felt the same way. But then a simple glance at him gave her the answer. He was about elated as any man, or boy actually, was in that situation, but her fear of being replaced was unfounded. The fondness in Xing's eyes didn't dim at all. I'm glad you enjoyed it. This will be interesting though. AZULA rolled her eyes, even as she leaned against Xing. Of course it'll take work. But don't tell me you're not keen on it. I'll be lying if I said so, he admitted with a chuckle. Sure, he's been regarding Suki with admirable politeness. Even more so than Tai Li in fact. But AZULA would bet her place beside him if Xing didn't enjoy exploring this new relationship at least as much as she did. Suki's competence and her history with him probably ticked off a few of his boxes. The girl being eager to all but throw herself at him also helped. AZULA herself wasn't too picky. She admired Kyoshi Warrior enough, and Tai Li was still sorting herself out. Sure, she could just pick some handmaidens to discreetly figure things out, with Xing's approval, of course. But this was more fun for everyone involved. At the same time, the princess made a strong, conscious effort to continue ignoring the political benefits of tying a vaunted Kyoshi warrior to Boss Sing Se, though, with how much you're kissing your thumb right now, I suppose I'll have to quickly find you new bodyguards so Suki can be reassigned and you two can continue to explore this new interest of yours? AZULA lightly smacked her prince on the chest. You make it sound like I'm some desperate and lonely spinster from the theater plays. She let out an annoyed huff and then muttered, It's not like I have the time right now, anyway, and it'd be rude to do any exploring with Xing left out entirely. Quite true. Speaking of which, my princess, Xing placed a light kiss on her forehead, and then another one on the tip of her nose, and finally a firmer one on her lips. We've got a meeting coming up soon with the delegation from the Northern Water Tribe. AZULA couldn't help sighing. It's either some form of work or another. Well, on the bright side, everything is coming to a head. The big day was just a couple of weeks away. The couple began to leave their room to head for the throne room. Right, you said there's some Southern Water Tribesmen as well. Yeah, King Bumi was generous enough to pass along a message to Sokka's and Katara's father. I'm actually surprised they actually made it here at all. AZULA wasn't. Not with how occupied the Fire Nation Navy must be now, more than ever, in maintaining the sea lanes between the home islands and the Earth continent. Enough regions managed to enact AZULA's order for Scorched Earth to endanger the invaders' supplies if the never-ending stream of convoys stopped. It made those particular areas of water practically impenetrable, but also opened up the rest of the ocean for the water tribes and Earth kingdoms to move about more freely. All the levity suddenly fled as AZULA pieced together the overall plans and came to a somber realization. We've got the water tribes tolerating us, an all but official ally in Omashu who leads a confederation of Earth Kingdom states. The rest of the Earth Kingdom is in no position to threaten us. It hurts knowing we'd still achieve all of that without my father's idiotic mess. We could have leveraged all that diplomatic power to ensure a solid peace plan. Xing took her hand and gave a comforting squeeze. It is not your fault for striving to rule the colonies as a princess should. I know, she lied. Xing stopped and turned to AZULA with a sad smile. It is my fault for not fully considering your father's insecurities as I offered you this path. I'm sore dash, she stopped him with a finger on his lips. Don't. I bear responsibility for willfully ignoring my father's idiocy. I was a fool to overlook it, to think that he'd be content with praise and appeasement. She thought he was like her old self, simply seeking affirmation by her lessers of how great she was. I should have known I held merely an echo of my parents' flaws. AZULA, Xing said in a warning tone as they returned to that familiar stomping ground, and she waved him off even as she dispelled that dark train of thought. It wasn't proper to speak of such things in front of the bodyguards and nearby servants anyway. I know. I'm not them. She leaned in to give him a quick but appreciative peck on the lips. Thanks, Xing, for being with me. You make it hard to do otherwise, my princess. The princess rolled her eyes at the cheap flattery, and they continued their walk to the throne room to receive their guests. Leaving behind the intimate topic, AZULA returned her focus to the matters at hand. Remind me again, the Northern Water Tribe princess, the Avatar's friend, is engaged to her, right? Can we use that as an option to thaw out relations quicker? Pledge some protection to the boy, or host her here to give them some time together. Diplomatic foundations were fully set in Ba Sing Se in little time at all, thanks to earlier agreements Xing had fostered with the Northern Water Tribe and Omashu. A tentative coalition was formed, built on several agreements between the three factions behind closed doors. None of the representatives gave vague promises. A simple mutual defense pact was agreed upon, but only unofficially, to last only as long as Fire Lord Ozai remained on the throne. King Bumi sent an order back to Omashu to begin liberating the continent. At the same time, emissaries would be sent out to treat with King K's followers, to distract them away from mustering against Ba Sing Se. In exchange, Xing gifted the Mad King the ledgers seized from the palace's archives. A good portion of the small mountain of tomes tracked the tribute to the throne, owed by the states and certain high nobility. How many men each state was expected to muster in defense of the throne. How many crates of food, raw materials, and luxury goods should enter Ba Sing Se each month. The number of noble scions slated to staff in the palace. The information contained within was terrifyingly comprehensive. Just as important, the other half of ledgers held the official claims for land and titles throughout the continent. It was, until Xing's conquest anyway, what defined the boundaries, limits, privileges, and succession of the Earth Kingdom's landed nobility. The claims could be disputed, but unless amendments were made, Earth Kingdom bureaucracy referred only to those ledgers regardless of what protesting claimants might say. Iroh understood the value of the ledgers, and he knew that their worth was perhaps being overinflated here. But then again, it wouldn't be surprising to find Xing having already struck a different bargain with Bumi at an earlier date. Probably the direct support of Ba Sing Se should the Mad King end up having to clash with the deposed King K. Princess Yu, on behalf of her father Chief Arnuk, pledged military aid in the form of naval raiders to strain the Fire Nation's sea lanes. The Agnikila would also lend its healers should Ba Sing Se require it. For their service, shipwrights from the escaped colonists were dispatched to the north, to try and revive the hulks salvaged from the failed Fire Nation invasion of the North Pole to bolster the Water Tribe's navy. Also, a massive stockpile of wood and metal equipment, both civilian and military, was being prepared to be delivered to Agnikila, as a step towards bringing the tribe's industrial and military capability up to par with the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. A similar but scaled-down offer of material was given to the representatives of the meager force from the Southern Water Tribe. In exchange for nominal recognition of Xing's rule over Ba Sing Se, Chief Hakoda graciously accepted. Though from the looks of it, he was happy to simply be present and involved. The Southern Water Tribe had fared far worse than its northern counterpart after decades of Fire Nation depredation, and would require a long road in restoring its power and influence over the southern seas. Also, the man was clearly distracted at reuniting with his family. It was heartwarming to see Hakoda in tears as he met with Kylan, Katara, and Sokka. Iroh kept smiling at the scene as melancholy washed over him, recalling his own lost family. His beautiful wife Hitomi, who'd passed far too early from illness, his dear son Lu Ten, who fell in combat. Even his father, the late Fire Lord AZULA, whose passing was now being regarded with suspicious eyes by AZULA. Iroh dared not give the theory any credence, lest it drag him down a fearful dark path. He'd wait until solid evidence was provided, or on the slim chance Ozai was captured. The old prince sighed heavily as he thought of his brother's future. Xing had made no promises, and AZULA was far blunter about preferring her father dead. Only the fact that Ozai's fate ultimately rested on young Aang facing him gave Iroh some hope for seeing his brother alive, at least for a short while. How would Zuko take it? Iroh wondered. How would he take all of this, once he's been informed of everything? It was a question Iroh would find answered soon. Hopefully. With little over a week left, the grand operation began. A small army of AZULA's agents boarded Water Tribe ships to infiltrate the home islands. At the same time, Aang went through final preparations before flying with his friends to the Fire Nation's palace. Xing and AZULA would meet up with them later, as the young couple would be at the head of the counter-invasion. They first would have to bring Ozai's army on the continent to heal, which was why they were leaving with the majority of the 11th again, this time accompanied by King Bumi and his band of volunteers. Iroh pitted his countrymen on the other end of the conflict. With all the movement out of the city, Iroh was left to serve as Ba Sing Se's steward with a garrison almost entirely composed of men belonging to Generals Yu and Sung. Both men's loyalty, or at least their obedience, was solid enough by now to be relied upon to keep the city in safe hands. But AZULA still had a few of her palace staff keeping a discreet eye on them and their subordinates, just in case. Things seemed secure enough that Iroh would have to settle for keeping track of the news as they streamed in. He also likely had enough time to attend to the unenviable task of thawing relations with the village of Hidden Clouds. Iroh didn't complain. Earning the trust and forgiveness of the Airbender remnants was far from an ignoble thing. He also saw it as a form of penance on behalf of his family's involvement. If he had to make one complaint, though, Iroh perhaps wished that AZULA hadn't assigned Sue as his assistant. Right, they're gone, the old widow said once Xing and AZULA marched out the breach-turned gates, and turned to Iroh with a mild glare. Come along, Prince Iroh. We've got a lot of work to do. Blame your niece and nephew-in-law for being too competent that there's probably a room full of reports for you to go through by now. If we're lucky, we'll manage to have it before the next round of paperwork comes flooding in. And then we'll get to enjoy lunch, or an early dinner, depending on our luck. It was hard not to sigh. As you say, Lady Sue. Sokka assured himself that the bittersweet farewell at the docks would be the last time he'd be parted from his family. You included. Take care, Dad, he muttered as he took his turn hugging his father. You too, Sokka. I'm proud of you. Hakoda's beaming smile earnestly relayed that notion, rather than the half-smile, half-grin he was wearing ever since Katara all too happily told him about Sokka's engagement to you. Speaking of, you received a wry grin. Thank you once again for taking in my son, Princess Yu. The light blush dusting Yu's cheeks gave her a pretty glow. Please, just call me Yu, she corrected for the nth time. We will be family soon. Family. The word still struck Sokka as he heard it from Yu's lips, or as it left his own. They'd be married soon, be a family. Katara, is your brother drooling? Toph's voice suddenly intruded, and before Sokka could react his sister responded. No, but his jaw's hanging a little. Thought so. Hey, I was just thinking. Sokka weakly defended as she turned towards the giggling Katara and Toph. Anyway, where's Aang? He asked Toph, who had initially been in the palace. She gave a shrug, and with a hand wrapped in metal bands stabbed a thumb over her shoulder. He's with Teo getting Appa ready. Her words were mildly accentuated by the creaking of metal as the bands around her limbs creaked to conform to her movement. Metal bending should be impossible, from what Sokka understood from the earthbenders gasping in shock at the time. But somehow Toph had managed it by doing some funky bending juju that no one else had considered before. Bumi was clapping his hands and cackling gleefully, while the cranky badger mole Yama was grumbling up a storm of disbelief at having a blind girl of all people pioneer the new bending. Toph had invented metal bending, but Sokka had to remind himself that it was Xing who came up with the idea of shoving her into a metal box to overcome her weakness. After all he's learned from the Scorpion, that cannot possibly be a coincidence. The guy knew way more than he was letting on, and was bloody annoying because of it. But at least he was doing it for the benefit of the good guys, and his record for vague hints and unfathomable actions still hasn't led anyone astray yet. Which was why Sokka took Xing's words very seriously when the prince came up one day for a private chat. You're likely going to have to kill someone to get to Ozai. I know, Sokka had replied with a grim and resolute nod. That's why I'm bringing my sword along, after all. They shared small grins at the poor humor before Xing continued. You're going with your friends, your sister. How far will you go to protect them? Sokka frowned at Xing as his heart hardened at that familiar topic. Very. The Scorpion nodded at that, and then loudly snapped his fingers. Sokka watched as a couple of servants entered the room, pushing in a rack with a thick blue-colored attire hanging off it. The servants carefully extracted the clothing, revealing it to be a blue-dyed variant of the brigandine armor Xing and his soldiers wore. There were noticeable differences, like the white fur lining and a beautiful steel wolf helm. Judging from the metallic jingling as the armor plates clinked off each other, It probably was a little lighter as well. We might not be friends, but please accept this gift from an adopted little brother who'd do anything to protect his family, to an older brother who wishes to do the same. Sokka stared dumbly as he took the suit of armor in his hands and felt the comforting weight of metal and padded cloth. He stared at the wolf helmet, its quality clearly far superior than anything owned by the warriors of his tribe. Then he turned to Xing. Thanks, Xing. The prince gave a rare, snarkless smile. You're welcome. If Katara complains, feel free to say I did it out of political considerations. PFT. Right. It was probably half true knowing Xing. It'd be bad for his diplomacy with the water tribes if Sokka fell in battle, and Xing would earn cheap goodwill on the chance that the armor did save Sokka from a mortal blow. Still, Sokka appreciated the gesture, whatever the true intentions. For a scorpion, you're not too bad a guy. For a water tribesman, you're not too shit a warrior, the prince retorted with a grin. They exchanged friendly insults as Sokka gave the armor a try, and once the weight settled on his body and he moved about in it for a bit, Sokka found himself immediately enamored by his present. Maybe not as much as the meteor sword, but only by a small margin. Xing, the swell guy, offered pointers on what vulnerabilities to look out for, and what moves worked or didn't work. Sokka spent the rest of the day in the armor, earning Aang's compliment and Katara's mild annoyance. Toph was indifferent, since she was basically a walking metal statue already, and was still riding the high from everyone's amazement. Returning to the present, Sokka watched as his father took off in an Earth Kingdom merchant junk carrying food, tools, and more to begin rebuilding the South Pole. After that, it was a nice, warm hug and a slightly embarrassing but much savored kiss in front of everyone to see you off. I'll see you soon, she promised. Yeah, was all Sokka managed to mumble as he stared at his fiancée's beautiful face. That's enough gawking, lover boy. Katara just had to make a scene by yanking him away. Take care, you. I promise we'll look after Sokka for you. That was a cheap shot. Hey, I can take care of myself. Thank you very much. They watched the Northern Water Tribe ships leave, and Yu's waving figure become an indistinct speck in the distance before the three of them headed back to the palace. Aang and Teo were waiting for them with a rather impressively outfitted Appa. The fluffy air bison wore barding that consisted of mail that covered most of him, and several metal plates protecting various vital points. A massive chamfron protected Appa's head, leaving only his mouth clear as his eyes were protected by swirling grills. Teo was just folding away what seemed like glider wings into Appa's flanks, probably to help him fly farther or something. Still, the overall look made Appa look menacing indeed. Appa looks different. Of course, Katara, with her girly sensibilities, would not see the awesomeness that way. He's a bit heavier, that's for sure, Toph commented. That's what the wings are for, Teo explained as he patted on the folded wings, confirming Sokka's initial impression. Dad says once deployed, they'd help take nearly half the weight. Should help during long flights. There's latches near the saddle that'll help drop the whole thing. Or reattach it. Quickly if you need to. The boy's face scrunched up a bit. Xing wanted to attach a metal barrel filled with blasting jelly to, help Appa move faster. But everyone agreed it was a stupid idea. Appa's not a firework, Aang agreed with a stern nod. Though, I guess it's worth trying out if I can help speed up the flying by fire bending like the soldiers. I can't wait to find out, Toph commented dryly. They took to the skies later, and as they saw the soldiers leaving Ba Sing Se shrink into a barely visible trail of dots, Sokka idly began to wonder how lucky he and his friends were to miss out on all the carnage that was about to come. Or almost all, if Xing managed to make it to the palace in time. Bujing kept the advance of his army at a cautious pace, being thorough in crushing any resistance he encountered. He was taking his time to ensure that his supply lines were robust. Practically half the army was on foraging duty at any time to bolster the rations coming in from the ports, on the off chance that they might get cut off temporarily. After the last incident with an abandoned village's seemingly barely touched granary, Bujing's punitive expedition would burn down any village or town stores they found. The usual looting from the enlisted soldiers resulted in a rash of poisonings as they shared the meats and buns they'd pilfered with their comrades, well before the physicians and apothecaries could verify the purity of the food. Worse, some of the clay jars of dried food contained false bottoms, which hid trapped vermin that happily infested the army's stores after they were inadvertently freed. It forced the whole advance to stall for 3 days as the troops purged the starved rodents and insects, and it came at the cost of almost a quarter of their fresh supplies. During that time, they had the misfortune of falling prey to rebel partisans, who managed to set fire to a further fifth of the food. A smaller but not insignificant amount of water was also lost during that raid. Compared to that, foraging for poisonous mushrooms and unidentified fruits seemed a much safer alternative. By the time the raiders were all hunted down, morale had plummeted, and Bujing was in no mood to tolerate any further setback. The army remained camped for a further 2 anxious days for resupply before they continued their advance. It was a most inauspicious sign of things to come, from Bujing's perspective. The High General's concerns were further proven true when they encountered a mob of fleeing, half-naked men. They were survivors from High General Wulong's combined army, and the dread tales they brought with them made Bujing regret being out in the continent. Wulong was dead by the scorpion's hand, and his combined force shattered and scattered in all directions to spread the news. The rebel princess was also in the field, apparently slaughtering her own tally of loyalist commanders. Worse, Wulong's army of 20,000 was routed by an enemy force of not even a third of that. And this was a battle on open grasslands, not a siege where such a disparity in numbers made more sense. To top it all off, the prince and princess now had dragons under their command, to go along with tanks that spat fire and soldiers that could somehow fly. A lesser commander might write off the tales as mostly hyperbole. That Wulong was indeed isled, but battlefield hysteria caused the men to justify their cowardice with tall tales. Bujing was not a lesser commander. He'd read what Xing could do. He'd personally heard of what happened to Zhao. It was too late to stop the spread of the disastrous defeat, especially with more fleeing survivors potentially running into other groups. So Bujing acted immediately to slow the fear's growth instead. Send one hawk back to deliver the news back to the capital. Then send the rest to all commanders on the continent. Have their armies gather at the shores of the West Lake, and then we'll march as one to take on Ba-Sing-Se. Avoid the Scorpion's forces if possible. If not, send messages of the enemy's locations before martyring themselves for the Fire Nation. Tell them that, with the inter-army communication dealt with, the High General then moved on to dealing with the infected communication within his own army. Morale had dropped to a point where there was already a trickle of deserters beginning. Capturing the cowards and executing them before their former comrades was a temporary balm to the problem. But Bujing had to get to the root of the issue. The men needed something tangible to raise their spirits. Wine and increased rations would not be enough. Bujing needed victories. Any victories. He set his army loose on the next group of partisans they encountered. Their underground hideout was fully burnt to ash and turned into an open grave for the rebels. Bujing let his men vent their fears on the fanatical peasants who died with their princes and princess names on their lips. He overlooked the desecration of the corpses and the slow, torturous execution of the few unlucky survivors. It got some of the dread out of the troops' system. That was what was important. The expeditionary force kept their morale afloat by pouncing on several more civilian resistance groups. Bujing's only rule was that the rebel women be executed along with the men, instead of being captured as playthings. Allowing the latter would only end up as a distraction to his men, and potentially serve as a security vulnerability. The soldiers were free to have whatever way they wanted with any rebels they captured, but no prisoners would remain after they broke camp on the following day. The simple tactic kept the army marching all the way to the West Lake, where they met up with and assimilated other punitive forces. Some of the expedition groups suffered significant losses. 2 had lost almost a third of their forces, particularly their cavalry, in trying to stop the rebels from harassing their march. Others suffered losses from traps and suicidal raids. Mutiny saw at least 2 armies losing about a quarter of their strength. One unlucky group was half-starved and lost more than half their numbers, including their general and most of the command staff, to poisoned food and water. Desertion further brought their ranks down to barely a quarter of their original strength. Bujing immediately promoted the lieutenant commanding the battered survivors to general. Such talent, especially in the face of adversity, should not be overlooked. Despite the ordeal they all face, after waiting for 9 days for the rest of the punitive forces to catch up, the combined might of the muster still amounted to a mighty 400,000 men, with nearly 10,000 tanks and double that number in cavalry. In any other situation, it would be an awe-inspiring force. Bujing doubted it'd be enough to replicate Prince Iroha's siege on Ba Sing Se, not with Princess AZULA rousing the evacuated colonists to man the defenses, not with Prince Iroha's cunning and wisdom providing counters to the Fire Nation doctrines he was keenly familiar with, not with the scorpion dragon Xing, who broke the very same city he was now defending by himself. It was relief of sorts then, when Bujing received exhausted scouts that told of the rebels marching out of the city in force of around 30,000 men. It was certain that both Xing and AZULA were leading it, and they were headed west, just missing Bujing's force by a few miles if they did not deviate from the roads. On the one hand, it meant that the biggest worries to sieging Ba Sing Se was now gone, though it was a meager consolation as Prince Iroha was likely still in the city manning the defenses. But at least now the siege actually had a chance of succeeding. It might also force the Xing to turn back, ruining whatever reason he was marching out in the first place. Yet there was also the fact that even with a minimal garrison, Ba Sing Se's walls and breaches would take weeks, if not months, to actually be overwhelmed. Bujing was sure that Xing employed turncoat earthbenders, who could, as a last resort, collapse the walls to bury entire regiments under an avalanche of brick and earth. And then there'd still be mountains of rubble-turned ammunition for the surviving attackers to climb through. Even if they endured all of that, there'd still be a second wall to endure. By that time, Xing could have already accomplished whatever goals he set out to do if he simply opted to ignore the loyalist army. Worse, the Scorpion might be heading westwards to begin razing the ports that fed supplies and reinforcements to Bujing's army. Not only would it starve them out, it'd also strand them on the continent. And if Xing managed to capture a few ships, they could realistically fool or convert the naval patrols and aim for the home islands. Damn that boy, Bujing cursed as he stared at the map in his command tent, and then glanced up to the assembled generals. We've no choice but to intercept the rebel army, and it was likely Xing knew it as well, the scheming little bastard, which meant that he'll be prepared. Should we aim to envelop them? One commander proposed, not unreasonably. With such a numerical advantage, standard doctrine called for a complete encirclement before tightening the noose and thoroughly destroying the trapped target. Bujing sighed as he pondered over the possibilities for a few seconds. Against predictable earthbenders and their levy fodder, I'd agree with you. However, we're dealing with Xing and his band of traitors here. They've knowledge of Fire Nation strategies and ploys, and have likely taken our usual approaches into consideration. Another general, one of the newer ones promoted by the Fire Lord, spoke up with some indignation. What then? We cannot just cower from them. We hold the advantage of numbers against these rebels, spirits touch Scorpion or not. With some maneuvering, we can bring them to battle in favorable terrain as well. That was unfortunately true. Bujing stared at the map again, and then heaved out another sigh before fixing a glare at the assembled commanders. We'll send out our greener infantry formations first to try and intercept the rebels. Their one and only job is to keep the enemy pinned and worn while the rest of the army catches up. The High General ignored the sour looks on some of his subordinates. The tanks and cavalry will guard the flanks of the main force until we're ready to engage the rebels, and then they'll conduct flanking and encirclement maneuvers as appropriate. With all due respect, High General, a general said, might we be overestimating the rebels' capabilities? Bujing snorted audibly at that idea. Fool, you're talking about a boy who's made a reputation for stringing victories while outnumbered. One mere boy leading a regiment, however battle-hardened, does not break armies and cities with simple intimidation tactics. And considering how easily he declared his rebellion, the accuracy of his more recent battle reports might be suspect. Right now, I would rather overestimate his reputation and trample him swiftly than underestimate him and suffer High General Wulong's fate. Fixing a glare fueled with all the authority of his rank, Bujing's voice lowered to a steely order. We move out tomorrow morning. Either 6 generals will volunteer to head the vanguard by the end of today, or I will nominate them once the marching orders are given tomorrow. For all the haste Bujing's orders were carried out, the sacrificial vanguard of 120,000 barely created a lead from the main army by the end of their first day of their forced march. The banners of the tail end of the infantry martyrs could still be seen down the road, even as the main force set up camp. In the meantime, Bujing kept busy through the night, trying to piece together Xing's likely moves. The High General held no illusion that the vanguard he sent out would be broken. He just wasn't sure how quickly or how worn the rebel force would be after that. He'd have to plan his attrition rates carefully. Orders were given to prioritize taking out the enemy vehicles first, to provide some advantage in mobility. After that, it'd be down to a bloody grind. By the third day of intercepting, Bujing had to amend his calculations when he noticed that nearly half of the scouts he sent out to keep track of the rebels had not reported back. On the fourth day, barely a fifth of them either showed up or sent their updates via messenger hawks. However, desperate runners from the vanguard brought news of Xing's force being sighted. Battle was expected to commence the following day. Bujing had his main army hasten their march on the fifth day to catch up with and reinforce the vanguard, only to encounter more messengers bringing bewildering news that the enemy was nowhere to be seen, likely having relocated at night. By now, the only scouts the army had left were those that remained keeping watch of its perimeter. The main army caught up with the confused and frustrated vanguard on the seventh day. All 120,000 soldiers were spread around where the rebels were last seen encamped, poking about cautiously but futilely for any sign of the enemy. With their vision hobbled, Bujing had his army set up camp with the vanguard and prepared to sacrifice some of the light cavalry to serve as eyes and ears for the army. They had the mobility, but not the training to keep a discreet eye out for enemy movement. The High General resigned himself to writing off maybe a division's worth of ostrich horses to give his army some ability to see ahead. It proved to be a moot idea, as late into the seventh night, as the soldiers recuperated from the weary marching and Bujing was busy refining his battlefield plans, half of his tent sank underground with barely a warning. The High General had all of 3 seconds to be confused before the command tent's heavy fabric fell over him, and the furniture, and the braziers and candles. Bujing hastily burned his way free from the smothering blanket, and as the silk and leather covering fell clear of his head, he found himself in the middle of bloody mayhem. Neat holes dotted the ground, half-swallowing tents and palisade sections. Armored figures were casually climbing out of them with weapons or flames in hand, their outlines highlighted in baleful orange from the fires breaking out as tents and braziers and torches toppled atop of one another. Kill for the Scorpion Prince. Kill for the Phoenix Princess. Most of the confused loyalists were still recovering from the sudden appearances of sinkholes around them, and fell easy prey to the enemy ambushers. Spears stabbed into men still in their nightwear as they crawled out of their tents in a daze. Officers barely managed to get their hands on their weapons when they were pounced on by war cleavers and daggers. The earth rose up to crush or impale soldiers trying to rally around their sergeants or captains. Flames incinerated groups of barely armed soldiers as they sought to organize into their squads as deep-drilled training urged. The whinny and grunts of startled ostrich horses and Komodo rhinos cut across the din of flames and screams as tanks trundled up from larger pits and began spitting streams of fire. Spirits. Bujing would have remained rooted to the spot if not for the noise behind him triggering his instincts to quickly leap aside. He fell into a roll despite his age, and quickly got up into a fire-bending stance, and found himself facing off against a grinning, muscled figure that was the Mad King. "Hey, looks like I got lucky and bagged myself a High General." Bujing barely managed to channel his chi when Bumi casually stomped his feet and crushed him almost to death in a neck-high prison of earth. The High General gasped as the tightly packed dirt slammed into his body from all directions. That nothing broke was a minor miracle. Through tears of pain staining his vision, Bujing saw King Bumi walking up to offer a humiliating grin. "Now don't move a muscle. We'll come get you right after the fun's over." And the Mad King turned away without acknowledging Bujing's furious indignation, and with another stomp of his foot, the earth cracked outwards and a rift opened up to swallow up an officer and his rallying men. Another stomp and a push of his arms, and a tsunami of dirt rose up and tore through men and tents, leaving a long trail of churned earth and pulp corpses. The Mad King stalked off with a cackle, churning spikes up to shred anyone in his way, or more waves of earth to bury any significant groups that caught his attention. "Kneel if you wish to live." Bujing strained to turn his head when flashes and roars from one side caught his helpless attention, and he saw the rebel prince and princess joining in the chaotic melee. Princess AZULA led a group of soldiers, ruthlessly cutting down any who stood in their way. Bolts of fire and walls of earth rendered any resistance against them impotent. AZULA stopped as she came across a gathering mob of firebenders, her earthbenders' walls protecting her group from the barrage that followed. Bujing felt cold dread wash down his straining spine as the princess fell into a familiar stance. Index and middle fingers of both hands pointed out as her arms moved in circular motions. Blue-white light sparked from her fingertips, and when she finally lanced one arm out at the mob, a blinding bolt of lightning blasted through the earthen wall between them and forked out throughout the firebenders that dared stand against her. More lightning followed after that, as her soldiers stood guard around her and gave her the time she needed to deliver the devastating attacks. Despite the terror that filled Bujing, it somehow got worse as he heard uncanny roars from the skies. Something darted past his constricted view, something snake-like and winged and trailing flames. The High General heard armor and bones breaking from where the figure darted towards, as well as the gurgling screams of men being brought down by predators. One of the figures flew by, slower this time. Claws latched onto a hapless lieutenant as its elongated maw chomped out chunks of his neck and shoulders. Bujing saw a dragon for the first time, burning what's left of its victim before flying off, and he felt the crushing pressure around his waist ease a bit as his bladder slackened. High General Bujing remained a captive audience for spirits know how long, forced to experience his army crumbling around him. At some point, he saw Xing's white flames somewhere nearby, and shortly after, ash fell from the sky like snow. Bujing also watched several doomed attempts by varying officers to rally their forces, but it only created easier targets for the rebels to focus on, particularly the cackling Mad King. Bujing's eyes ached as Princess AZULA let loose lighting to any and all who dared point a weapon or raise a flame her way. Her guards were especially ruthless in keeping any challengers from getting too close, particularly a girl garbed in a green battle dress and red armor. It was only when the distinctive war fan slashed out to slit throats or loosen jaws that Bujing realized that the exiled princess had somehow gotten the famed Kyoshi warriors on her side. How much of the Earth Kingdom supported the rebels? If only Bujing had the luxury of being free from this bloody slaughter to figure out the answer. Come dawn, the flames had mostly died out, as did the screaming. Moans of the wounded floated along the stench of burnt and ruptured bodies. Whimpers squeaked out from the soot-stained survivors of the punitive expeditions as the surrendered soldiers kept their knees, hands and foreheads pressed against the burnt and bloody dirt in a bid to preserve their lives. Rebel soldiers stalked among the smoking tents and mangled bodies, either to pull out or mercifully end any breathing form they came across. "Ah, High General," Xing's voice called out from one side, and then seconds later the scorpion dragon came into view, smirking triumphantly as two dragons almost as long as he was tall floated behind him. "Good to see you're still with us." Seconds later, Princess AZULA appeared at Xing's side, her wrathful glare fixed on Bujing. "Xing, yes, my princess? We only accept the surrender of those who kneel before us. Is that right?" Bujing found fresh terror rushing through his strained heart as Xing nodded. "True, but that was during the fighting." He inclined his head towards the High General. "And it's not like he has a choice in that matter yet." The scorpion then gave a vicious grin. "So, High General Bujing," the boy's voice rang out clearly across the ruined campgrounds, "what choice will you make?" The earthen prison suddenly slackened, and Bujing fell in a heap of aching muscles. He glanced over his shoulder briefly to find King Bumi smiling too warmly at him. Bujing glanced back to the prince and princess before him, and too exhausted to even sigh, he let himself fully crumple to the ground as he lowered his head. High General Bujing offers his unconditional surrender.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.